Repossessed, Book 6 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Chapter 1. My phone rang, the ringtone a repetition of the mournful hymn, "In sin I wandered, sore and sad." I swung around, irritated. Mum had changed my ringtone again when I wasn't looking. For somebody who barely knew how to turn on a computer, she could sure do tech when she was motivated. Her voice blared down the phone. "Laurel, I have Irish ancestors. Ian showed me how to work the Ancestor website." "Hello, Mum. Well, that's good news. I'm glad I have Irish ancestors." Mum huffed. "You don't have Irish ancestors, Laurel. I do." I wasn't about to explain it to her. I pulled a face, both at her comment and at the mention of Ian, Mum's particularly irksome and much younger church friend. I was about to hang up when she added, "Come here right now. Remember I rented a room to that nice man, Dylan Jackson? He just called to say he'd be a day early. Come over and help me get his room ready." "Okay." I hung up. The so-called nice man, Dylan Jackson, was well known around town. He had an eye for the ladies and liked to party hard. He now lived in Sydney, but people in this town still spoke about him, so great was his infamy. In fact, his brother had refused to allow him to stay with him, which is why Dylan was renting a room from Mum for the duration of his visit. I jumped at the loud thunderclap. I pushed the pile of papers across my desk and walked to look out the window at the 2 sheep grazing happily in the paddock opposite my office. The grass was dry and parched. I hoped the thunderstorm would bring some decent rain. I grabbed an umbrella and had only taken a single step out of the front door of the funeral home when I heard the screech of tires on gravel. The sound was coming from Mum's house. I turned in that direction, but before I had gone 5 paces, Ian's car sped past me. Even from the distance, I could see Ian's face was deathly white and his jaw was hanging open. I shook my head and headed for Mum's house, which, unfortunately for me, adjoined my property. When I moved back to Witchwoods, I had lived in my old bedroom, but was soon able to finish the apartment above the funeral home and move in there. Still, it wasn't far enough away from my mother. I put up the umbrella to ward off the faint raindrops and jumped when another thunderclap reverberated close by. When I reached the house, Mum was nowhere to be seen, but her front door was wide open. I thought it strange that Ian hadn't even bothered to shut it. I walked into the living room and saw Ian's phone on the floor. As I crossed over to pick it up, I could hear Mum's voice. I looked at the phone and nearly dropped it in shock. "Mum, your phone is on FaceTime," I said in disbelief. She did not respond to that, but simply asked, "Where's Ian?" "He's driven away. What happened?" Even as I spoke the words, it dawned on me. Mum was still talking. "Ian and I were quoting our favourite scriptures about sinners to one another, as we like to do, when I needed a bathroom break." "Mum, your phone's on FaceTime," I said again in horror, before having the presence of mind to flip it off. "Stop repeating yourself, Laurel," she said. "That's got nothing to do with it. I asked you where Ian is." "That has everything to do with it," I told her. "While you and Ian were quoting scriptures to each other on your phones, you accidentally flipped your phone to FaceTime and Ian could see everything." I shut my eyes tightly and then added, "Everything." I heard my mother's sharp intake of breath. She hung up. I didn't want to wait around to be the object of her wrath, so dropped Ian's phone back on the coffee table and hurried to the door. I almost felt sorry for Ian, as much as I disliked him. When the ghost of a punk rocker had recently possessed Mum, she, or rather the ghost, had flashed a murderer in an attempt to distract him, and Ian had come through the door at the wrong time. That, coupled with what Ian had just seen, was probably enough to keep him in a terrible state for a long time. I was only halfway back to the funeral home when I heard Mum's screeching tones. "Laurel! Laurel!" I sighed and turned. I figured I might as well go back and get the earful I was expecting. Before I reached her, I heard a car behind me. Surely Ian wouldn't come back so soon for his phone. He was probably halfway to Sydney by now. The car pulled up and a man got out. I summed him up quickly. Looked as though he was out of the 80s. Thick gold chain around his neck, white shirt open to the waist, denim jacket, 2 tight jeans, a bushy Magnum-style moustache. He sauntered over to me and seized my hand just as Mum arrived upon the scene. "You must be Laurel," he said, smiling widely and looking me up and down. "What a shame we never met." I snatched my hand from him. He turned to Mum. "And you must be Laurel's sister. Where's Thelma?" She smiled from ear to ear. "Actually, I'm Thelma," the man gasped. "Impossible. You must have been married very young." He turned to me. "I'm Dylan Jackson. Your mother has told me all about you over the phone. Maybe we could have dinner." He winked. Another crack of thunder prevented my reply. The man clutched at his stomach. "I haven't been feeling well all day." He leant back against his car. My mother hurried over to him. "I will pray for you." Before I could stop her, she grabbed the man by his shoulders. "Out, foul spirit of sickness!" she screamed at the top of her lungs. He jumped away from her in terror. A gust of wind lifted my umbrella out of my hands. I turned to run after it and presently retrieved it from Mum's garden bed. When I looked back at the car park, Mum was still gripping the man's arm. "Out, foul demon of sickness!" she screeched again. The man clutched his stomach and bent over. "The demon is leaving him, and his sickness is going," Mum called to me in a triumphant tone. "If he doesn't watch MasterChef or listen to anything but gospel music, he should remain demon-free." I stood there, not knowing what to do. I figured I should try to do something, but when she was on a roll, there was no stopping her. "Mum," I began in a tentative tone, when a flash of lightning boomed overhead at precisely the same time as a deafening crack of thunder. It must have struck something near me. The umbrella blew over my face as the smell of burning hit me. I pulled the umbrella off my head, but Mum and Dylan Jackson were no longer standing where they had been seconds earlier. That's when I saw them both lying on the ground, and they both looked dead. Chapter 2. "Mum!" I hurried over to her and shook her arm. She did indeed look dead. The man moved a little and groaned. I pulled my phone from my pocket and called 000. "My mother's dead, and a man was struck by lightning too. He needs help!" I yelled into the phone. I gave them the address and then hung up before calling Basil. Before he had a chance to speak, I yelled, "Basil, Mum's dead!" I hung up on him too. I was about to start CPR when Ernie materialized in front of me. He came straight to the point. "I have some bad news for you, Laurel. I don't know quite how to tell you this, but I think the sooner you know, the better." I pointed to my mother. "I already know, Ernie." Ernie floated over to me. "No, I'm sorry, Laurel. You don't understand." I fought back a wave of hysteria. "Yes, I do. My mother's dead." "No, that's not it," Ernie said with a groan. "And CPR won't work. I saw it all happen. I was standing there when they got struck by lightning. I've heard about this before, but I've never seen it for myself, not until now. Ghosts talk, you know." "I have no idea what you're talking about." "Laurel, your mother hasn't gone." The realization suddenly struck me. Of course, Mum was now a ghost. I clutched my cheeks with both hands, and I realized my mouth was forming a perfect O. "She's a ghost," I said in terror. "She's going to haunt me forever." Ernie shook his head solemnly. "It's worse than that." I looked at Ernie in shock. "How could anything be worse than that?" Ernie floated above me. "I really don't know how to tell you this." I narrowed my eyes. "Just come straight out and tell me, Ernie, and please don't float." "Okay. When your mother was struck by lightning, that man died at the same time." Was the whole world going mad? I held up both hands to the sky. "No, he's alive." "He's only alive because your mother's spirit possessed him." At this point, I wondered if I was dreaming. Yes, that was it. I was having a nightmare. One of those dreams that seems real. You're sure you're not dreaming, that is, until you wake up. I shut my eyes tightly and willed myself awake. When I opened my eyes, to my dismay, it hadn't worked. Ernie was still hovering in front of me. "I've heard of this before," he continued. "If two people die at the very same instant, sometimes the spirit of one will go into the other, and that act keeps the possessed person alive and well." "So my mother's possessed this man?" Ernie nodded. "She sure has." I was aghast. "What, forever?" Ernie held both hands in front of him. No. Her spirit will leave him at some point and then go back into her own body, and she'll be fine. That is, unless she's been buried. That wouldn't be good, if you get my meaning." Basil arrived, his car spraying gravel wildly when he braked. He jumped out of the car and ran over to me. "Laurel, what happened?" "You don't have time for lengthy explanations, Laurel," Ernie advised me. "If the paramedics take your mother away, she'll be dead." Basil scratched his head. "She's not already dead?" He bent over and peered at my mother. I grabbed his arm. "Basil, Mum and this man were struck by lightning at the same time, and Ernie tells me that Mum's spirit has gone into this man, and that's keeping him alive." I stopped speaking to draw a breath. "So your mother is dead?" Basil asked. "Yes. No. Her spirit will eventually go back into her body and she'll be fine. Well, back to what's normal for her, that is. But not, of course, if she's already been buried. We have to hide her body until we can get her spirit back out of that man." "Good explanation." Ernie nodded his approval. "I couldn't have explained it better myself. Look, I hear the sirens. Don't stand about. Hide your mother's body. If the paramedics see her, they'll take her away to the morgue." I sized up the distance to Mum's front door. "Hurry, Basil, put her in your car." I thought Basil would ask questions, but he picked my mother up and struggled to his car with her. I hurried after him, holding her feet, although I don't think I was much help. We threw her in the back seat unceremoniously and slammed the door just as the ambulance arrived. A woman paramedic jumped out of the ambulance. "Where are the victims?" I pointed to the man's car. "He's there." "Weren't there two victims?" "No, just the one." A man paramedic joined her. "Didn't you call in that your mother was dead?" I shook my head. "Oh, no, I said dead to me. I wanted to give the man mouth-to-mouth, but my mother said I'd catch germs. We had a terrible argument. My mother's a very difficult person." The paramedics exchanged glances before hurrying over to the man. "That's Dylan Jackson," Basil said with surprise. "He used to live around here." "I've heard all about him, although I'd never met him," I said. While the paramedics bent over Dylan, I drew Basil away. "Take your car and park it at the funeral home. Can you take care of matters there, and I'll be along soon?" Basil nodded and hurried to his car. I breathed a huge sigh of relief and then walked over to watch the paramedics. I tried to recall my words. I was fairly certain I had said, "My mother is dead." I hoped I had talked my way out of it. I watched at a distance until one of the paramedics approached me. "He's refusing to come with us," she told me. "He says he wants to be in his own house." I wasn't too sure just how possessed the man was. "He lives in Sydney?" I said tentatively. She looked surprised. "He says he lives here." Oh, yes, he's boarding here. That must be what he meant, I said, smiling and nodding as I spoke. I had used the most reassuring tone I could muster. I certainly didn't want them to take Dylan Jackson away and question him too closely in case my mother spoke through him. Please keep an eye on him and call a doctor if anything seems amiss, she said. The ambulance was barely out the front gate when Basil sprinted around the corner. Where's Mum? I whispered. She's still in the car. You didn't put her on ice? I asked him. He shrugged. I didn't know what to do with her. I'll have to ask Ernie. Ernie at once solidified in front of us. Yes, you will need to keep her frozen in the morgue at the funeral home until her spirit goes back into her. Her body is dead for all intents and purposes, so you have to keep it safe until her spirit returns to her. Am I making sense? No, Basil and I said in unison. Ernie muttered some rude words and then added, It's quite easy to understand. If your mother's body dies before she repossesses it, then she'll be really dead. Is that clear? I nodded. Perfectly clear. But what are we going to do with him? He hasn't actually turned into Mum, has he? I certainly hope not, Ernie said. I walked over to Dylan Jackson. His eyes were darting wildly from side to side. Are you all right? I really think you should have gone to hospital to get checked out, I said to him. Nonsense, my dear girl. I need to go to my room. Basil hurried to my side. Hi, Dylan. Long time no see. He shook the man's hand. Would you feel better staying in a hotel closer to medical help? After all, you were just struck by lightning. Without waiting for a response, he fetched Dylan's suitcases out of the boot. Dylan shook his head and stomped his foot. No, I have booked in and you must not break the promise to me. Let your yea be yea and your nay nay, lest ye fall into condemnation. James chapter 5 verse 12. He clutched his stomach again. Are you all right? I asked him. Stop repeating yourself. He buttoned up his shirt in double quick time. The good Lord will look after me. Please show me to my accommodations. Basil appeared by my side. Can I have a word with you? He guided me over to the Bougainvilleas and whispered, I don't like that man staying here. He's a notorious womanizer. He has the most dreadful reputation. He'll probably have all his friends around for a drunken party. I doubt he'll be like that anymore, I told him. Not with Mum possessing him. I fought the urge to laugh hysterically. Basil nodded. Just be careful. I'm sure Ernie's exaggerating and your mother won't have any effect on him. Dylan followed me into the house. He pointed to the huge, gilt-framed painting with the embroidered words, The wages of sin is death. What a beautiful house. How tasteful. How edifying. Thanks, I said. Basil nodded to him. I'll show you to your room. I sat down on the sofa and put my head in my hands. It was all so surreal. But I didn't even know a spirit could possess anyone until that punk rocker possessed Mum, I said to Ernie. Don't tell me this is another case of possession. How could it happen twice? Ernie nodded slowly and then said, Repossession. I looked up to see Basil coming down the steps 2 at a time. Laurel, you were right. Something's wrong with Dylan. He's suddenly found religion. He asked me to find him a King James Version Bible. He said it was the only one God wrote. Ernie and I exchanged glances. I fought a wave of hysteria. But what are we going to do? I wailed. Mum possessed this guy. This means we have to hide Mum's body until her spirit goes back into it. I was about to say more, but Ernie interrupted me. As soon as the man's spirit recovers from the shock of dying, his own spirit will return to him. He'll be okay, and your mother's spirit will return to her body. All's well that ends well. But how long will that take? I asked him. A day? A week? A month? A year? Ernie shrugged. No idea. How long's a piece of string? It will take as long as it will take, and that's all I know. He pouted. "Don't shoot the messenger." "We'll possibly have to hide Mum for a long time," I lamented. "What will Ian do?" Basil sat next to me and patted my shoulder. "Don't worry, Laurel. We'll tell Ian that your mother has gone on a religious retreat to, maybe the Simpson Desert. He won't follow her there." That made me feel a little better. "That's a good idea. The church people will wonder why she didn't say goodbye, but we can say she decided suddenly." I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. "I think it will all be okay. We can do this. Oh, I'll have to give Janet time off. That means I won't be able to hold any funerals until Mum's back in her body." "But you can't do that," Basil protested. "You still need to run the business." I thought for a moment. "I'll worry about that later. For now, there are no funerals booked. Okay, so the plan is to keep Mum on ice and manage Dylan. Hopefully he's not too possessed." Basil agreed. "Ernie, is there anything we can do to get Thelma's spirit back into her own body sooner?" Ernie was silent for a moment before speaking. "You would need to make Dylan happy and relaxed. You know, play the sort of music he likes, feed him well, that sort of thing. Once his spirit is happy and rested, your mother's spirit will leave him." Basil stood up. "We had better get your mother inside the funeral home now. It's a good thing Ian is the only person who ever visits her. Nobody will ever notice she's missing." We were about to leave when the landline rang. I walked back to answer it. "Mrs. Bay," said the disembodied voice. "No, this is her daughter, Laurel. Can I take a message?" "This is Detective Roy Prescott. I need to speak with Mrs. Bay." "She's not here," I said. "Is something wrong?" The line crackled, and then the detective said, "There's been a murder at the Birds of Prey Church Community Garden, and your mother will be able to help us with our inquiries. We need to speak with her as soon as possible." "I'll leave her a message. Detective Prescott, it's not safe to speak on a landline in a thunderstorm." With that, I hung up. "What was that about?" Basil asked. "We have to hide Mum before the police find her. I'll tell you about it on the way." I sprinted out through the door, followed by Basil and Ernie, who floated behind us. Chapter 3. Basil and I struggled to get Mum into the funeral home. As soon as we were inside the front door, I locked it and said to Basil, "Leave her there and get the trolley. I don't know why I didn't think of that before." I ran to the preparation room to fetch the trolley, and Basil and I maneuvered Mum onto it. I threw a sheet over her so I didn't have to see her. "She's not really dead, you know, Laurel," Ernie said from behind me. I let out a shriek and swung around. "You scared me." Ernie looked quite put out. "I'm a ghost. That's what we do." I shot him a glare and hurried behind Basil as he pushed the trolley down to the preparation room. I opened the door and at once averted my eyes, but Basil was unable to get Mum onto the slab by himself, so I had to help him. "I already told you she's not really dead," Ernie said once more. I swung to face him. "Well, she looks dead, and it's creeping me out. I'll have to get her out of that guy's body as soon as I can." "You'll have to be extra nice to him and keep him happy. Do everything he wants," Ernie said. "Since Mum has possessed him, I wonder what sort of things he will like to do," I wondered aloud. "Do you think Mum will emerge from him?" Ernie frowned. "I don't know what you mean." I took a deep breath. "When Jezebel possessed Mum, sometimes Jezebel would speak, but sometimes Mum could speak. Will it be like that with him? Will Mum come to the fore and speak to people through Dylan? That would be really bad." I trembled. Ernie shrugged. "I don't know. Only time will tell." With that, he vanished. "You're no help," I called out to thin air. I turned to Basil. "What do we do now?" "We'll have to make sure Janet doesn't come to the funeral home and find your mother." I thought for a moment. "We don't have any funerals booked, so she has no reason to come." Basil nodded slowly. "Hopefully. Then there's the other matter. What do we do about the police?" The police, I echoed, and then it hit me. Oh, yes, the police will need to speak to Mum, so we will have to have a good excuse as to where she is. Oh, and her car's here, so we'll have to hide her car or say she took public transport somewhere. Basil leant on the stainless steel table in the middle of the room. I think it's best to leave her car in the garage, because if we hide it and they find it, it wouldn't look good. No, I think we'll have to say she has gone somewhere. But where? We'll have to tell Ian the big lie too, I pointed out. And it would have to be something to do with the church, because Mum never does anything if it's not related to the church. Maybe we should say she's gone to rehab. Basil looked at me as though I had taken leave of my senses. But your mother doesn't drink. She told me she signed the temperance pledge at the age of 8, and she's never let a sip of the demon alcohol pass her lips since. I thought for a moment. What do people go to rehab for, apart from alcohol and drugs and... My voice trailed away. Sex addiction? Basil offered. I clutched my stomach and laughed so hard I could scarcely breathe. Nobody will believe that. I know. She always watched The Bold and the Beautiful. She never missed an episode. But nobody would go to rehab for watching too much TV, Basil protested. I shook my finger at him. Hello? You know my mother. She would. Ian told her she shouldn't watch it so much. He said the people dressed inappropriately and cavorted out of wedlock. Cavorted? Basil raised an eyebrow. His words, not mine. But it doesn't sound logical. I smiled. Then it's perfect. My mother isn't logical. Everyone will believe that, even Ian. Basil walked over and put his arm around my shoulders. That's one problem solved. But as the police suspect your mother, they will do their best to track her down, so you'll have to keep to your story. You'll have to say she took off, and you have no idea where she went. I mean, everyone in town knows the two of you aren't particularly close, so I'm sure the police will believe that she didn't take you into her confidence. We made our way out of the funeral home, and I locked the door behind me. The rain had stopped, and the air was clear with the freshness that only comes after a storm. We'll just have to play it by ear, I suppose, I said. It doesn't matter if Ian doesn't believe us. It only matters whether the police believe us. And we have to make sure Dylan Jackson doesn't suddenly turn into Mum. Remember all the trouble we had with Jezebel? Basil groaned. We had almost reached the house, and a crack of thunder made me jump. It's going away now, Basil said. We only got a small amount of rain in that storm. The drought is the least of my worries at the moment. Oh, just a minute. I'll meet you in the house. I ran back to my apartment and fetched a bottle of white wine. Mum, of course, never had any wine in her house. Basil was waiting for me on the front porch. I showed him the wine. We're going to need this. I shot him a look and opened Mum's front door. To my surprise, Dylan Jackson was awake. He was wearing Mum's sensible tartan bathrobe and sitting in her favourite chair, a recliner rocker. This couldn't be good. That meant he had gone into her bedroom. I walked over to him. Mum, I said tentatively. Mum, are you in there? Laurel, have you completely lost your senses? He said. Do I look like your mother? Well, I never. He pursed his lips and folded his arms primly on his lap. Laurel had quite a shock seeing you struck by lightning, Basil said. Dylan nodded. Yes, and wasn't there a woman with me? What happened to her? There was no woman with you, I lied, unless you are thinking of me. Dylan frowned hard. I'm finding it difficult to remember. It was a most unpleasant experience. It was only then I realised he was reading Mum's Bible. He must have seen me looking, because he said, Is there a church meeting tonight? Maybe a prayer meeting? I'd like to pray for those who are not as good and holy as I am. Despite the fact he spoke in a male voice, his tone was entirely like Mum's, sanctimonious. I'll check on that for you, I said. Basil, could you help me in the kitchen for a moment? As we walked away, Dylan called after us, "Please don't pour any of that detestable, unrighteous liquid for me. It would be better if you smashed that bottle." "Jesus' first miracle was turning water into wine," I called over my shoulder. It wasn't the first time I'd used that on Mum. As soon as we reached the kitchen, I grabbed Basil's arm and pulled him around the door. "I don't think Mum is going to come out and be herself entirely," I said. "It doesn't seem to be the same as the last possession." Basil readily agreed. "You think that's a good thing or a bad thing?" I thought about it for a minute. Normally, logically, it should be a good thing. But as Mum's involved, it has to be a bad thing. Basil patted my shoulder in a reassuring manner. "It's good that he's not speaking in her voice, and it's good that he doesn't remember anything. He doesn't know your mother is possessing him." Ernie materialized slowly. "I didn't want to frighten you again," he said in a tone which showed he was not at all sincere. "Thanks," I said dryly. "I've never seen it before for myself, as I told you, but that fits in with what I've heard," he said. "You know, it's a lot more common than you think." I was in disbelief. What? 2 people dying at the very same time, and then one going into the body of another and possessing them? Ernie nodded. "Exactly." "Then do you have any advice for us?" Ernie nodded again. "Yes, I do. Keep your mother alive at all costs. The worst thing that could happen is that she actually dies and becomes a ghost. I really don't want your mother for company on the spiritual plane." He looked as though he was about to burst into tears and promptly vanished. I turned back to Basil, but before I could say anything, Ernie reappeared. "Laurel, you've got company, and you're not going to like who it is." With that, he vanished once more. Chapter 4. I hurried to the living room. Dylan was still reading the Bible aloud to himself. I peeped around the heavy velvet brocade curtains at a car I didn't recognize. "That's not Ian's car," I said to Basil. "It's probably a detective's car." I went cold all over. I didn't want to look out the window any longer, so I sat on the sofa and waited for the knock on the door. I crossed to the door and opened it, doing my best to plaster an innocent look on my face. "Miss Bay?" I nodded. "You would remember me, I'm sure. I'm Detective Prescott, and this is Detective Peter Packwood, whom you haven't met before." "Yes, of course I remember you," I said. Detective Prescott was one of the detectives on the case when a dead, naked escort had been found in my mother's bedroom. I hoped this would play to my advantage, as Detective Prescott knew my mother was as mad as a hatter. I wondered what happened to Detective Wilkinson, who had also been on that case, but I wasn't about to ask. I stood aside to open the door widely. "Please come in." The detectives walked into the living room. I offered them a seat, but they chose to remain standing. "And where is your mother?" Detective Prescott asked me. "You know what my mother is like," I said, shooting him a significant look. "This morning she said she needed to go into rehab." Prescott's eyebrows shot skyward. "Your mother? Rehab? Whatever for?" "She had watched too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful," I told him. "She thought it was a sin, and so she needed to go to rehab." "That sounds like your mother," Prescott muttered. I tried not to look too relieved. Prescott pushed on. "And when exactly did she leave?" I shrugged. "Well, I don't see much of my mother, even though we live next door to each other. She told me this morning, but I have no idea when she actually did leave. She was awfully embarrassed about it, you see. I doubt she even told the details to her best friend, Ian. She only told me because she wanted me to water her garden and look after her new boarder while she was away." "And where is this rehab center?" Prescott asked. "I have no idea. She doesn't speak to me much, and she certainly didn't tell me that. Maybe Pastor Green knows. You could ask him." Detective Packwood spoke for the first time. "When did you last see your mother?" A surly man with small, beady eyes, Packwood reminded me of a venomous snake. This morning, I have no idea if she left then or later, and I have no idea where she's gone. I expect she will come back at some point without telling me. Prescott looked over at Dylan. And who is he? That's Dylan Jackson, I said. He used to live in Witch Woods, but he now lives in Sydney. He's back in town for a visit, and he rented a room from Mum for the week. The detectives walked over to Dylan. He stood up. When did you arrive in Witch Woods? Prescott asked him. Only a few hours ago. And have you seen Mrs. Bay since your arrival? He shook his head. Basil walked over to them. Actually, Dylan was struck by lightning when he arrived, and we had to call the ambulance. They wanted him to go to hospital, but he refused. He's had quite a nasty shock. No pun intended. The detectives exchanged glances. Prescott turned to me. If you do hear from your mother, would you get her to call us? He handed me a card. Before I could respond, he added, And if she does call you, I'd appreciate it if you would call us to let us know where she is. My stomach clenched. Sure. Detectives, can you tell me what this is about? Detective Packwood took a step forward. I was unable to avoid the rich, overpowering notes of lime and mothballs emanating from his cheap aftershave. It was all I could do not to sneeze. We want her to help us with our inquiries. Yes, we realise that, Basil said. But your inquiries into what, precisely? When the detective hesitated, Basil added, Come on, detective. You know this is a small country town. It will be all over the Bush Telegraph today at any rate. You might as well tell us. Packwood allowed himself a small sigh. Tom Trent was murdered earlier today. I scratched my head. Tom Trent? He was one of the members of the Birds of Prey Church Community Garden, Detective Prescott supplied. I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. My mother had complained at length about Tom Trent to all and sundry. It was becoming more apparent to me that Mum was indeed a suspect in the murder. The detective pointed to me. Call me the second you hear from your mother. I will, but I might not hear from her. We're not exactly the best of friends, you understand. The detectives both nodded before heading for the door. I shut it behind them and leant against it. I was about to say something, but Basil put his finger to his lips and inclined his head in Dylan's direction. Before I could do anything else, there was another knock on the door. I expected the detectives had forgotten something, but there, to my horror, was Ian standing on the front porch. Ian, I said in alarm. He pushed his way past me and walked into the living room. Dylan broke into a wide smile and gave Ian a little wave. Ian swung to face me. Where's Thelma? That was when I remembered the incident with Ian's phone and Mum. It had gone completely out of my mind. Thankfully, I had told the detectives I had last seen my mother that morning. Ian, Mum's booked herself into rehab. Booked herself into rehab? Ian said in disbelief. That can't be right. She would have told me. She was too embarrassed to tell anybody, I said. She only told me because I had to look after her new boarder here. That's him over there, Dylan Jackson. Ian stared at Dylan. Mum said she was horribly embarrassed, and she hoped to be healed of her sins before she could come back and confess her sins to you. Ian appeared somewhat mollified. What sins, precisely? He said, his eyes glinting with curiosity. What could Thelma possibly have had an addiction to? She was righteous. Oh, not that anybody is righteous, he added as an afterthought. The bold and the beautiful, I said, doing my best to keep a straight face. She was ashamed of the fact that she was addicted to it. She watched it every day. Ian nodded slowly. Yes, of course. I should have seen that coming. I did tell her that the people were dressed rather inappropriately and did rather immoral things. It was hardly edifying to watch such a show. I told Thelma that time and time again, but she did not appear to listen to me." "She finally did listen to you, Ian," I said, "and that's why she was too embarrassed to tell you. She's going to ask for your forgiveness when she gets back, completely healed of her addiction." "It's not my forgiveness she needs, dear," Ian said smugly. "There is but one who can forgive." I resisted the urge to kick him in the shins, and instead said, "Quite so, quite so." Ian's hand flew to his forehead. "Oh, I almost forgot why I was here. It's a terrible matter. Tom Trent has been murdered." "Yes, the men who just left when you arrived were detectives. I'm sure they suspect Thelma." Ian's hand flew to his throat. "Suspect Thelma? Surely not. Why would they suspect Thelma?" "Because Mum and Tom Trent didn't like each other, I suppose. What do you know about the murder, Ian?" "I'm not one to gossip," Ian said. "Whoso keepeth his mouth and his tongue keepeth his soul from troubles." Proverbs chapter 21, verse 23. He shot me a smug look. "But why didn't Mum like Tom Trent?" I pressed him. "Your mother didn't like Tom Trent because they were in the community garden together and Tom Trent grew corn." I waited for him to come to the point. After a lengthy interval, I prompted him. "Corn?" Ian nodded vigorously. "Yes, it grows tall, and sun-loving plants can't grow in shade. It's not a high-yielding crop, don't you understand?" "Yes," I lied. "So how was he murdered? Was he stabbed? Shot?" "He was poisoned," Ian said. "He was found face down in the community garden, dead and murdered. It's all over town." "Is it all over town who might have done it?" I asked hopefully. I jumped as music suddenly blared from Mum's sound system. It was the worst possible funeral church music. The music was so bad that no clients had ever requested I play something so awful at any of the funerals I had ever run. Ian ignored my question and turned to Dylan. "Hi, I'm Ian. Your name's familiar, but I don't think we've met. You have good taste in music." Dylan sat down and patted the couch beside him. "Would you like a nice cup of tea and we can listen to this lovely gospel music collection?" Ian beamed from ear to ear. "I'd like that." Dylan turned to me. "Laurel, a cup of tea for both of us, please. Now don't just stand there looking at me. Off you go." He waved his hand at me in dismissal. Chapter 5. I was on my way to town to speak with Tara, my best friend. Her husband happened to be Duncan, who was one of the local uniformed cops in town. Tara was a witch, not the Hollywood fantasy-style witch, but a normal person who practiced traditional witchcraft. She knew I could see and communicate with ghosts. Basil had gone back to work, but I had asked him to check on Mum first. I couldn't shake the uneasy feeling that Janet, the cosmetician, might pop up suddenly and discover Mum, even though I knew that was illogical. There was no reason for Janet to appear and look in the mortuary cabinets when there was no work for her. Still, I wished there was somewhere better to hide Mum, but there simply wasn't. I burst into the cafe and at once spied Tara sitting at the back of the room. I made my way through the crowd to her and sat down. "Are you all right, Laurel? You look terrible. Is it because your mother is a suspect?" Her hand flew to her mouth as soon as she said it. "Oops. So she is a suspect then?" Tara nodded slowly. "Sorry, Laurel." "There's a lot more to it than that," I said, "but I need to have a coffee with at least 5 heaped spoons of sugar in it before I can tell you." Tara raised her eyebrows by way of response. 1 hazelnut almond latte later, and I had filled in Tara. But, are you sure?" she sputtered. "Laurel, is this a joke? Or have you suddenly turned to drink?" I shook my head. If I was going to turn to drink, my mother would have driven me to drink years ago. No, everything I've told you is true and correct. "I can't believe this has happened again. 2 possessions. I didn't even know it was possible. I didn't either, I admitted. Now I have to keep Janet away from the funeral home and keep Mum's body alive. I thought about it for a moment and then added, well, safe at any rate, until her spirit can go back into her. The waitress came over and asked if we wanted more coffee. I sure do, I said, but maybe I'll only have 2 spoons of sugar in this one, and maybe I should have a lemon meringue pie. Tara ordered a triple iced Jaffa cake, and the waitress left. I rubbed my left eye with one hand. Where was I? I forgot what I was talking about. I was about to ask you a question, Tara said. How long before your mother's spirit leaves that man, and what happens to him when she does? I thought I had mentioned that already. Her spirit will leave him when his spirit has sufficiently recovered, and then it will go back into Mum and she'll be perfectly all right. That is, of course, unless somebody has discovered her and buried her. I realized my voice had risen to a high pitch, so I clenched my hand over my mouth and snuggled against the wall. And how long will that be? Tara asked. I shrugged. Who would know? That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And Ernie says it will happen sooner if Dylan is completely happy. So right now, apparently, we have to fulfill his every whim. Tara looked stricken. Not his every whim. His reputation is all over town. I chuckled in spite of myself. Yeah, that was before my mother possessed him. He's completely repented, trust me. But you said he doesn't know he's Thelma, and Thelma doesn't speak through him. I shrugged again. Yes, but she appears to have had a big impact on his behaviour. I've left him listening to Mum's style of gospel music. The 50 most depressingly mournful funeral dirges the world has known. That's not really the title, surely. The waitress came back to the table and deposited our coffees and cakes. When she left, I said, Dylan has taken a liking to Ian, and Ian has taken a liking to Dylan. Hopefully Ian can raise Dylan's spirits, and I won't have to bother too much. I will have to run after him and wait on him hand and foot, make him cups of tea and feed him nice food, I suppose. Tara ate half her cake before speaking. I don't envy you, Laurel. This sounds like a complete disaster. It is a complete disaster. Now you're going to have to help me with the case. Those detectives won't be able to focus on looking for the real killer because they suspect Mum. That means I'll have to solve it, and as soon as possible. They've already been around to the house asking where Mum is. Tara's hand flew to her mouth. Oh gosh, I didn't think of that. What did you tell them? I told them she went to a rehab clinic because she watched too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful and needed to break the addiction. Tara laughed. What did you really tell them? I drummed my fingers on the table. That's exactly what I told them. Ian will back me up. He always said Mum watched too many episodes. It was all I could think of at the time. Anyone who knows your mother will believe that, Tara said. And Detective Prescott does know your mother, so I'm sure he'll believe it. And I told them that Mum and I didn't exactly have a good relationship, so she didn't tell me where she was going. Tara finished her cake and twirled her coffee cup around. That was wise, Laurel. I don't think you should worry too much. Can't you leave it to the police to solve it? I'd like to do that, but I really can't. You yourself said they suspect Mum, so they won't be able to focus on the real suspect. Do they have any other suspects? I'll tell you everything I know. I leant forward eagerly. Thanks. I know the victim was Tom Trent, but that's all I know. Oh, apart from the fact that his body was found at the Birds of Prey Church Community Garden, and that's the church Mum attends. That's right. Tom Trent was widely disliked, and your mother had many arguments with him as she was on the garden committee with him. He ran the community garden, and the second in charge was a woman called Celia Watson. I imagine she's a suspect as well. And the fourth person on the garden committee was Eliza Entwistle. She's probably a suspect as well, because your mother, Celia, and Eliza all disliked Tom Trent, and he disliked them as well. I pulled out my phone and made notes on it. So Tom Trent was universally disliked, not just by the other church garden committee members. Tara pulled a face. I have no idea, to be honest. I'd never even heard of him. I only know what Duncan told me about him. But I do know Eliza. She's a retired primary school teacher. My old teacher, in fact. Do you know exactly when he was killed? I heard his body was discovered this morning. That's right. One of the garden members, don't ask me who, went to the community garden and found him. It was apparent he had been poisoned. How did they know it wasn't simply a heart attack? I asked. Duncan said he had obvious symptoms of poisoning, Tara said. Besides, they do grow lots of herbs there, and lots of herbs can be poisonous. I know that from my own craft practice. I mainly use things like dill for protection and breaking curses, lemon balm for health and basil for attracting money, rosemary for protection, as well as lemongrass for house cleansing. In fact, I use herbs for everything. I also use white snake root to keep snakes away, and I know it's quite dangerous if eaten. I buy my herbs from the church garden shop. That is interesting, I said. Tara, please let me know if you hear of any other suspects. Do you know anything about Celia and Eliza? Are they good, righteous churchgoers like Mum? Tara shrugged. I don't have a clue if they are, to be honest. I overheard Duncan on the phone saying that it was a plant-based poison, and I know that they suspect the church committee members, but that's about it. I thought it over. You know, that is a bit strange. If you were going to murder someone with a plant-based poison that you concocted yourself, wouldn't you make it look like an accident? I mean, surely that's possible. Tara laughed. I wouldn't say that in front of the detectives if I were you, Laurel. Anyway, when I find out what the poison is, I'll let you know. I'll see if I can find out before the sleepover tonight. Sleepover? Tara frowned at me. Laurel, have you forgotten? I'm staying at your place tonight for a girls' night, as Duncan's on duty. Oh, I had forgotten, to be honest, with everything that's been going on. Is it still okay if I come? I hurried to reassure her. Of course it is. That will be great, actually. I could do with some relaxation. Tara tapped the table. I just thought of something. Won't you be conducting Tom Trent's funeral? Most likely, I said, but nobody's contacted me yet, not surprisingly. Where will you put your mother? I bit the edge of one fingernail. I was thinking I could buy a really big freezer and put her in there. I wonder if they make human-length freezers. I don't think they make domestic ones, maybe only commercial ones. That would be thousands of dollars, I lamented. It seems a bit extreme to buy a commercial freezer to put Mum in just so Janet won't see her. Can you put a lock on one of those slidey things? Slidey things? I repeated. What do you mean? You know, one of those drawers that the bodies lie on and you slide into the freezer cabinet. I nodded. Oh, I see. The mortuary cabinets. No, you can't put a lock on them. Then where will you put your mother to hide her from Janet? I slumped forward on the table. I don't know. Tara grabbed my elbow. Oh no, Laurel. You won't believe who I just saw. Chapter 6. I spun around. Who? Dylan Jackson, and he was with 2 women, one on each arm. I jumped to my feet. Oh no. I grabbed my handbag and hurried out of the door, but Dylan and the women were nowhere to be seen. Surely he couldn't be too far away. I hurried down the street, looking up and down the length of it, and then retraced my steps, peering in every shop window. Finally, I was in luck. Dylan was sitting in my mother's favourite cafe, a rather depressing and small place with only one big table inside and 3 tables outside. It doubled as a wool shop, and the smell of musty garments hit me in the face as soon as I walked inside. As I walked in, a woman in rather revealing clothes walked past me. I hurried inside to see Dylan sitting at the table with 5 scantily dressed women. Dylan, are you feeling all right?" I asked him. "Laurel, please sit down. I was just telling these ladies that they were all dressed inappropriately. Please cover yourselves, ladies." They all laughed uproariously. The closest one slapped him on the back. "Oh, come on, Dylan. You didn't worry about what I was wearing the other night." Dylan appeared genuinely confused. "I don't recall seeing you the other night. Or maybe it was a brief encounter. Did I see much of you then?" The woman continued to laugh. "You saw a lot of me then." Dylan pouted. "I came here hoping to have a nice quiet cup of tea and have some nice quiet time to read my Bible." He pulled out one of the King James Version Bibles from my mother's house and slammed it on the table. The women looked confused. "Dylan, are you coming out tonight?" one of them asked. "Out where?" Dylan said. "Is there a prayer meeting at the church that I have forgotten about?" I could see the women were wondering whether he was joking. Finally, the one with the most makeup said, "Oh, I see. You're worried that our husbands would come after you." "Why would your husbands come after me?" Dylan said, clearly confused. He looked up from his phone. "I've consulted the online church calendar, and there is a prayer meeting tonight. I do hope you can all come." The women looked at him and then looked at me. One of them winked at Dylan. "Oh, sure. A prayer meeting. Sure, we'll come. Where is it at?" "Why, the church, of course." Dylan scratched his head. "Did you think it would be at a hotel?" "No, I'm staying at the bed and breakfast I told you about, but the lady of the home isn't there." "What a shame, because I'm sure she is the most wonderful person. She has the most impeccable taste in everything. Furnishings, music, you name it. Why, I am sure there is no lovelier person in the world than that lady." The one sitting next to him grabbed his elbow. "We'll come over to your house and have a party tonight," she said. "We'll bring the drinks." "That would be lovely, but there will be no need to bring anything to drink. There's plenty of English breakfast tea at the bed and breakfast." They all burst into laughter. "What time?" one of them asked. I cleared my throat. "Excuse me, that is my mother's bed and breakfast, and wild parties are not allowed." Dylan shot me a stern look. "Nobody can come to the bed and breakfast tonight because I'm going to the prayer meeting. Isn't that right, girls?" They all burst into laughter. I was at a loss. I thought I might as well leave, but just as I made to stand up, my phone rang. I looked down at it and was surprised to see the caller ID announcing Ian. What could he possibly want? "Hello?" I said tentatively. I hoped he hadn't discovered that my mother hadn't left town after all. "Laurel," he said breathlessly. He didn't say anything else, and he sounded as though he was about to cry. My hand went to my throat. Surely he hadn't discovered Mum's body in the funeral home. I was certain I had locked the door. "What is it, Ian?" "I went to your mother's house," I gasped. "You're not in the funeral home?" There was silence, and I imagined him shaking his head. After an interval, he said, "No, I went to your mother's home to walk around it 7 times. "7 times?" I echoed. "Why on earth would you do that?" "Because they walked around the walls of Jericho 7 times, of course," Ian said in his most patronizing tone. "Isn't it obvious?" I nodded goodbye to Dylan and walked out of the cafe. I stood on the street with one hand over one ear to block out the traffic noise, and I pressed the phone against my other ear. "Maybe you should explain it to me," I said through gritted teeth. Ian sighed. "Honestly, Laurel, with a good mother like yours, I thought you would have known more about the Bible. Joshua walked around Jericho 7 times blowing the trumpet, and the walls fell down." "Thanks for making it so clear," I said, injecting as much sarcasm into my tone as I could. "And did you have a trumpet?" "No, I didn't." This time he sounded dejected. He pushed on. Maybe that was an oversight on my part. I did yell, though, just like the Israelites. And did you want the walls of my mother's house to fall down? Of course not. I felt as though I was going completely mad. I took a deep breath and then said, "And so, Ian, why exactly were you marching around my mother's house 7 times? That is to say, what was your purpose? If you didn't want the walls to fall down, then what was your objective in doing this?" "I was praying against the demon of television," he said. I wasn't sure I had heard him right. The demon of television? Yes. Your mother is in rehab for watching too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful, so I thought I would support her with prayer. He said it as though it was the most reasonable thing in the world. Finally, it made sense to me, although maybe sense wasn't actually the right word. So because my mother is in rehab, you thought you would march around her house 7 times to support her? That's right. Ian's voice held a note of triumph. I rubbed my forehead. And you called me to tell me that? Oh no, it was the most terrible thing, Ian gushed. I almost forgot, so distracted I was about Jericho and the trumpet. No, the police came here. They were looking for Thelma. They cross-examined me at great length, and they asked me if I was lying. I told them liars don't inherit the kingdom of God, but they didn't seem to care. Can you imagine that? That's terrible, I said. Ian readily agreed. I almost thought they were going to force me to accompany them to the station to make a statement. Laurel, they really think your mother could be a murderer. He burst into tears. Chapter 7. Are you sure you want to put yourself through this? Basil was in my apartment. Thankfully, when I had moved into the apartment, I had put a spiritual barrier around it so Ernie, or any other ghost for that matter, would not be able to gain entry. I liked my privacy. A pity it didn't work on my mother. I don't really want to, I lamented, but what choice do I have? Basil nodded slowly. It does seem the police are closing in. If your mother wasn't, His voice trailed away. Dead? I prompted him. Basil looked down at his coffee cup and then twirled it around. Yes, if she wasn't, dead and therefore missing, the police would be able to question her, and then maybe they wouldn't be so suspicious. Her being missing doesn't look good for her at all. They think she committed the crime and then left town. That's why they questioned Ian so thoroughly. And that's precisely why I have to go to this prayer meeting tonight at the Birds of Prey church, I said. Some of the suspects will be there, and I'll be able to keep an eye on Dylan. Your mother hasn't actually spoken through him yet, though, you said. I nodded. And I hope it stays that way. Still, he's turned very pious and sanctimonious just like her, and he seems to have lost all of his old characteristics. And that might be a good thing, depending on how you look at it, Basil said. I'm sure there's no need to worry. I mean, what's the worst that could happen? If your mother speaks through him, no one will believe it's really her. But the police will take him and subject him to a psychiatric evaluation. If they end up speaking to my mother through Dylan, they'll think he's stark raving mad, and they'll lock him away. Ernie told us that we have to keep Dylan happy and content. That won't happen if he's locked up in an institution. Basil drained the rest of his coffee in one go. Are you sure you don't want me to come with you? I shook my head. No, I'll be all right. And I know you've got a lot of work at the moment. They always have food after their prayer meetings, so it will give me a good opportunity to chat with the other suspects. After all, Tom Trent was murdered in the church community garden, and hopefully the suspects will be at the prayer meeting. And so, an hour later, I found myself at the Birds of Prey church. I walked over to the door and almost bumped into Pastor Green. He seemed as surprised to see me as I was to see him. Laurel, he said, I haven't seen you at a prayer meeting before. I'm keeping an eye on Mum's new boarder, just to make sure he doesn't get into any trouble, I told him. Pastor Green nodded solemnly. That's a good idea. He has quite the reputation. He seems to have changed, though, I said. You're not staying for the prayer meeting? Pastor Green looked stricken. Oh, no, I never stay for these types of prayer meetings. I was perplexed. What do you mean? What types? Pastor Green waved both hands in the air. Oh, you know, the ones your mother organises, like praying against devil's food cake, praying that Mr. Goddard will change his name to a more humble name, praying against swearing, and praying against the Channel 9 news. Now I was really confused. Why did they pray against the Channel 9 news? I asked him. A wearied look passed across the poor pastor's face. I have no idea. I didn't like to ask. We exchanged sympathetic looks. Pastor Green pushed on. Is there any way we can reach your mother? The police have been hounding me. I'm sure they suspect I'm covering for her. I had to explain to them that I wasn't a Catholic priest, and if I knew anything, I would be quite at liberty to tell them. I felt bad lying to the pastor, but I could hardly tell him the truth. She went to rehab because she wants to repent for watching too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful, I told him. Once more, he nodded sadly. Yes, I'm afraid that makes perfect sense to me. I'm sure it makes perfect sense to Detective Prescott also, as he has met your mother, although the other detective doesn't seem to believe it. Surely they don't think my mother actually murdered Tom Trent? I asked, hoping for some more information. I'm afraid they do, Laurel. If only Thelma could be here to defend herself, but alas, she isn't. If she does happen to contact you, please ask her to return to Witch Woods immediately. She won't contact me, I said, and that at least was the truth. Pastor Green nodded. Yes, you're right. She will contact Ian. He's in there now. The pastor pointed over his shoulder to the building. I did ask him to persuade Thelma to come home, but he burst into tears and said she hasn't contacted him. He's quite upset because I think they have been in daily contact since as long as I can remember. An elderly lady stuck her head out of the door. Is there anybody else for the prayer meeting? She called. Pastor Green, have you changed your mind? With that, he shook his head and hurried away, giving me a small wave over his shoulder. I shot the lady a weak smile and walked inside the building, handing the woman 2 packets of Tim Tams I had brought for the supper. The long wooden building was typical of a modern Pentecostal church in a small country town, one big hall with blue plastic chairs. For the church services, the chairs were in rows, but this time they all formed one big circle. I counted only about 20 people in attendance, and I hoped some of them were the suspects. Dylan glared at me, but Ian acknowledged me with a half nod. I sat down. The woman sitting next to me stood up. Thank you all for coming tonight, she said. Before we start praying for those not as good and well-behaved and moral as we are, I would like to state the meaning of this prayer meeting. We are all here tonight to pray against swearing. It is such an evil thing and has no place, yet people swear all the time. A murmur of agreement went up amongst the crowd. I fought back a nervous giggle. The woman was still speaking. After we have general prayer, we can pray for specific people who we have heard swearing, and then if anyone wants deliverance from the demon of swearing, we can pray over them. Is there anyone here who needs deliverance from the demon of swearing? They all looked at me. I averted my eyes. When I looked back up, to my relief, they all were looking at the speaker. Now we will all pray for the next hour. An hour? I wasn't looking forward to praying for an hour. Still, I could hardly leave now. I cast a look around the room and then shut my eyes. The woman immediately launched into prayer. Everyone shut their eyes and began praying aloud, although in soft tones. I opened one eye and then the other and looked around the room. The only people I recognised were Dylan and Ian. They were sitting next to each other. My stomach rumbled loudly, and I hoped they wouldn't want to pray to cast the demon of stomach rumbling out of me. I pressed my hand on my stomach, but that made it gurgle even more. Ian opened one eye and looked at me, so I shut mine firmly. The wooden seat was hard, and I shifted in it. Suddenly, I thought about my phone. What if it rang? Everyone would be furious. I grabbed my handbag, reached for my phone, and turned it to silent. I looked around the room. Nobody was looking at me, so I checked my messages and then my mail. I thought I had better not do anything else, so I turned off my phone and put my handbag back on the floor. I hoped there would be time after the meeting to talk to other people. My mother always mentioned the chats she had after the prayer meetings. Finally, the woman stood up. I assumed it was an hour later, although to me it felt like a week. My legs had gone numb from sitting on the hard chair for so long. My back ached. Now, does anybody have any specific prayer requests with regard to swearing? She looked around the room. Nobody took her up on the offer, although Ian put up his hand. If there is no specific need to pray for anyone about swearing, can we pray for Thelma? She's in rehab for watching too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful. Of course, the woman said. Poor Thelma, overcome by the ways of this world. We are in the world, but not of the world. Thank goodness she has repented and is seeking help. Although why she didn't come to us for prayer and deliverance is beyond me. I believe she was too embarrassed, Ian said. In fact, she wanted it kept a secret. But as we know, there are no secrets in the eyes of God, are there, Eliza? That's right, Ian. I looked at the speaker with interest. This must be Eliza Entwistle, one of the garden committee members, and therefore one of the suspects. Just then Dylan walked over to me. In Mum's voice, he said in accusatory tones, Laurel, why are you here? I said the only thing I could. Chapter 8. I was still sitting in a blue plastic chair. All the other people in the room were encircling me, their hands on my head, trying to cast the demon of swearing out of me. Thankfully, Dylan had not said another word and appeared subdued. There, I'm sure it's worked, Eliza said. Ian shot me a doubtful look. Do you really think so? He narrowed his eyes at me. Of course it's worked, Ian, I said, rather too brightly. Thank you, everybody. I'm most grateful for everything you have done for me. It was a blatant lie, but thankfully I was not struck down from above. Is there anything to eat? Eliza patted my shoulder. Everybody gets hungry after they have been released from a demon. Why, I have seen this time and time again on my trips to Europe. Yes, it's time for refreshments and fellowship. We walked to the back of the hall where there was a long wooden seat in front of a table with plates of cakes all over it. So I haven't seen you at prayer meetings before, Eliza said to me. No, my mother usually comes instead. Eliza seemed puzzled by my words, probably wondering why both of us couldn't come at once, but thankfully she didn't press me on it. It's a terrible matter, the murder, I said. Aren't you in the gardening club too? Eliza nodded hard. Yes, but Tom was the most unlikable man. He insisted on growing rows of corn, which meant that all the sun-loving vegetables could not grow. The rest of us had put in rows of sun-loving vegetables, such as tomatoes, watermelon, squash, peas, and beans. But his corn eclipsed them all. You couldn't ask him not to grow the corn. Eliza threw back her head and made a sound like a horse neighing angrily, followed by a few snorts. I wouldn't have been surprised if she had pawed the ground with her sturdy boot. No, no, no. Tom was a most unreasonable man. If he knew we wanted him to do something, he would do the opposite. I wonder who murdered him then, I said. She narrowed her eyes. Well, of course I don't gossip. Oh no, of course not, I said. It's just that the police suspect my mother because they don't believe that someone would genuinely repent and go to rehab for watching too many episodes of The Bold and the Beautiful. Eliza was clearly taken aback. The police don't believe that? No, imagine that. Anyway, they're trying to track down my mother and drag her out of rehab to answer their questions because they think she murdered Tom. Eliza snorted again. That's ridiculous. I nodded. I know. So I thought if I could think of anybody who might have a grudge against him, I could tell the police. That might get their attention off my poor mother, who simply wants to be praying and thinking while in rehab and repenting of her evil deeds. Tea? Eliza had been dipping a tea bag in a mug of boiling water. She dropped the tea bag onto a plate and handed me the cup. Thank you, I said. I wondered if that was her way of avoiding the subject, but to my relief she pushed on. Yes, I think that's a good idea. Well, I don't think anybody but God did like Tom Trent. He upset all the other gardeners. He was always doing mean things. Like growing corn? She nodded vigorously. And what else did he do? She looked aghast. Isn't that enough? That is a heinous thing to do, growing corn which throws shadows over all the sun-loving plants. She reeled off a list of sun-loving plants again. I took a deep breath and silently counted to 10. When she finished speaking, I added, What about his personal life? Did he have a non-gardening life? Did he have any enemies, or did he have any problems with any other people that you know? Maybe family members, a falling out with friends. It only just then occurred to me that they hadn't even mentioned Tom Trent at the prayer meeting. Eliza had her mouth open to answer me, but I cut her off. Did he come to prayer meetings? Of course not, she scoffed. He wasn't a godly man, not at all. He didn't even attend church. But then why was he allowed to grow things in the church community garden? Anybody can. They don't have to belong to the church. But he was on the committee, wasn't he? Along with you, my mother, and Celia Watson. She nodded slowly. Yes, we had to have one non-church member on the committee. It's in the rules. I see. My head was already spinning, probably from a lack of carbs, so I grabbed a nearby lamington and devoured it quickly. I tried to remember the last question I had asked her. Eliza had clearly remembered the question because after she devoured a Tim Tam, she said, Apart from causing us so much trouble on the church community garden committee, there was also the incident of the fence. The fence? I parroted. What fence? The fence around the church community garden? Eliza shook her head. The fence around his house. It's all over town. Haven't you heard about it? I had to admit that I hadn't. She pushed on. He has a long driveway that is tucked behind 2 other houses. You know, they call it a battle-axe block. There was an old wire fence, but he decided to have an expensive fence built. Why, the builders were working on that fence for weeks. The fence went all up his long driveway and then around his land. He had that expensive fence in common with 2 different neighbors. After the fence was finished, he went to each neighbor and demanded they pay a share of the fence. Is that legal? I asked her. She shrugged and then shook her head. I don't think so. He was supposed to ask them beforehand, but he didn't. He asked them afterwards. They both refused, so he threatened them with legal action, and they received legal letters. But if it's not legal, then why did they get legal letters? Because lawyers want to make money, I suppose, Eliza said with another shrug. The neighbors were furious. Tom had a few acres, and the fencing cost $80 a meter, so he wants $15,000 from each neighbor. But would somebody murder someone over that? I said, more to myself than to her. Well, somebody murdered him over something, she said. The police asked me if I murdered him over his corn overshadowing the vegetables. Can you imagine that? Did you tell them about the fence? I asked her. I sure did. I nodded. And he was poisoned. Do they know what poison was used? For the first time since I had spoken with her, Eliza looked decidedly uncomfortable. She set down her half-eaten Tim Tam and wrung her hands. I have no idea. Her eyelids flickered. Chapter 9. I was sitting in my bathtub, scented bubbles filling the air. I inhaled the heavenly fragrance of vanilla and strawberry. There was nothing quite so relaxing as a nice hot bath, especially after a traumatic prayer meeting. I had called Basil as soon as I had arrived home and filled him in on the evening's events. I'm sure he was glad he hadn't gone with me. I had just toweled myself dry and slathered myself with rose body lotion when the bell sounded from the front of the funeral home. I threw on my bathrobe, tied it tightly around me, and sprinted down my stairs. I flung open my apartment door and sprinted across the foyer. I hesitated at the front door, hoping it was Tara rather than Janet. I opened it a crack and peeked around. To my relief, Tara was standing there. I opened the door wide. Come in. I quickly locked the door behind her. You haven't heard from the police again, have you? Tara said, by way of greeting. My breath caught in my throat. No. Do you know something I don't? Lots of things, I'm sure, she said with a laugh, but not about the case. She thrust a bottle of wine into my hands. When I asked for a girls' night, I didn't think about you and Basil. I hope I didn't thwart a nice time with him. I chuckled. No, Basil has a lot of work at the moment. Come on upstairs. Tara went up first, and I turned and locked the apartment door behind us. Once at the top of the stairs, I threw myself on the couch. I'm exhausted, I said. The prayer meeting was simply ghastly. I'll pour us some wine, and you can tell me all about it. I gave Tara a brief summary, and she seemed to think it was entirely funny. You actually swore in a prayer meeting against swearing? I clutched my head. I did, but I can tell you I paid for it later. So was it worth going? Did you find out anything about the suspects? I shook my head. No, I did have an interesting conversation with Eliza Entwistle, but I wasn't able to speak with Celia Watson at all. Tara refilled my wine glass. What did Eliza say? She told me that the victim, Tom Trent, had a boundary fence argument with two of his neighbours, Russell Reed and Cameron Kerr. He'd sent them legal letters and everything. Apparently Tom built a very expensive boundary fence between his neighbours on both sides without asking them or even telling them first, and then he demanded they pay half. Tara's eyebrows shot skyward. But that isn't legal, surely? I shrugged. I wouldn't think so, but who would know? Still, as far as I know, the legal requirement is that the neighbour has to pay half of the cheapest fence possible, and what Tom built certainly wasn't a cheap fence. Anyway, he commenced legal action over it. Before Tara could ask, I held up one hand, palm outwards. And don't ask me why he could send legal letters when he probably didn't have a legal leg to stand on. It sounds as though you have made some progress. Is there anything to eat? Of course there is. I made some pizzas. That's what you can smell in the oven. Tara walked over to peek in the oven. They look good. And do you have ice cream? I scoffed at her. When don't I have ice cream? And I have chocolate too. I reached into a top cupboard and pulled down some chocolates. Why do you keep them up there? Tara asked me. Because Basil eats all the chocolate he can see, I admitted. He's worse than I am, so I have to hide the chocolate from him. I offered her one. No, we should eat the pizza first. Pizza first, then chocolate. I chuckled. Who made you the order of eating police? I popped a chocolate in my mouth. Tara tapped the side of her head. Oh, that reminds me. Talking of the police, that is. The poison was wolfsbane. Wolfsbane? As in monkshood or aconite? Those pretty blue or purple flowers? Tara nodded. You mean those deadly flowers? Duncan told me that's what was used. But how did they know so quickly? I asked her. Doesn't the toxicology report take a long time to come back? From what I can understand, it had to be a very fast-acting poison because his body was found early in the morning, and when the police went to his house, they found he'd had oats with honey for breakfast. There was a big jar of newly opened honey. They suspected the wolfsbane was in the honey because wolfsbane is very bitter, and the honey would have disguised the taste. I shook my head. That's all very well and good, but how did they know it was wolfsbane in the first place? Tara bit her lip and appeared a little confused for a moment. Okay, I'm trying to remember what Duncan said before he raced out of the door. I waited patiently for her to continue. The detectives knew it was poison because his body had ghastly and obvious signs of poisoning. They knew it had to be a fast-acting poison because Tom had been seen by several people the afternoon before and he was perfectly healthy. He hadn't been sick or coming down with anything, but he was stone-cold dead the next morning. Duncan said a big dose of wolfsbane will kill very quickly, and as I said, the victim was fine the night before. The detectives had the honey and the oats tested. I thought it over. I see. Obviously not many poisons could kill anybody that quickly, so they tested specifically for those poisons. That's my understanding, Tara said. Toxicology doesn't test for everything, but they obviously tested for fast-acting poisons and found out it was wolfsbane. What about heirs? Was he wealthy and did he have an heir? I silently berated myself. That was the first thing I should have considered. Surely an heir would be the #1 suspect. Yes, to both, Tara said. I waved my hand at her, nearly knocking over my wine glass in the process. Go on, tell me more. Tara shrugged. It's not too exciting. Tom has one heir, a son. I think Duncan said his name's Angus. Anyway, he's lived most of his life in Europe, and that's where he was at the time of his father's death. I'm afraid he's not a suspect, so your mother isn't off the hook. Are they certain about his alibi? Dead certain. Tara hesitated and then added, no pun intended. I opened the oven door and then shut it. Those pizzas will be a few more minutes yet. I'll grab my laptop and Google the poison. I went to my bedroom to fetch my laptop and walked back to the living room where Tara was scrolling through her phone. Quite a few people have been murdered with wolfsbane, she said. There are even 2 recent cases, and one where a woman put it in her husband's curry and killed him. I sat on the couch and put the laptop on my knees. Tara spoke before I could start searching. It says 1 gram will kill somebody in an hour. I gasped. What, 1/5 of a teaspoon? Tara nodded. But where would somebody get it? I asked her. Tara looked at me as though I had taken leave of my senses. The church garden, of course. I planted my palm on my forehead. It's been a hard day. I took another large gulp of my wine. So they grow wolfsbane in the community garden. Tara walked over and took my glass away from me. No more wine or chocolate for you until you eat some pizza. Yes, they grow wolfsbane. I told you they grow all manner of herbs. But I didn't know they grew deadly poisonous herbs, I said. This article here says that somebody died by brushing past wolfsbane. They grow the poisonous herbs in a greenhouse at the back of the garden, and they don't let the other gardeners in there, Tara told me. Duncan said that only the committee members are allowed in. I groaned. My mother's one of the committee members. Now they'll suspect her even more than they did before. So only Mum, the victim, Eliza, and Celia were allowed access to the poisonous plants. Tara nodded. And the greenhouse was locked, and only the committee members had a key. Maybe there's an extra key under a flower pot or a key at the church as well. I got up and walked over to the oven. They're ready. I put on some oven mitts and popped the pizzas on the bench tops. I suspect the victim's neighbours. Why? Surely their motive wasn't strong. I grabbed the pizza slicer. Maybe one or both of them had motives we haven't discovered yet. It would be easy enough to grow wolfsbane surreptitiously. The fact wolfsbane was used suggests to me the murderer wasn't a garden club member, as it's too obvious. It seems to me one of the neighbours poisoned Tom Trent with wolfsbane purely to throw suspicion onto one of the gardeners. Perhaps. So, are you going to the church camp tomorrow? I spun around to face her. Church camp? What church camp? Didn't you know? Duncan told me all about it. Your mother was going, and Eliza and Celia are booked to go. And Dylan is a late addition. Oh no, Dylan is going. Tara nodded. I figured you'd like to go too. But it's probably all booked out by now, I said. Possibly. But didn't you say you needed to keep an eye on Dylan? And Eliza and Celia must be the main suspects, what with the poisonous plants and all. But like I said, there are the two neighbours with the expensive fence as well, I reminded her. I have no idea how they'd get access to the greenhouse, so I suspect one of them was growing wolfsbane secretly. Think about it. It's too obvious that a known poisonous plant grower would poison the victim. Maybe that's what one of the gardeners was thinking. Seriously, Laurel, you need to go to the camp. You can't let possessed Dylan out of your sight for that long, and besides, 2 of the suspects will be there. But I hate camping, I said. I've never been camping. Then how do you know you don't like it? Tara said, rather too brightly. Go on, call Pastor Green now and ask him if you can go. I reluctantly picked up my phone. I had the pastor in my contacts, not only because he was the one who usually presided over the services at the funeral home, but also as he was the only one who could handle my mother, mostly anyway. To my dismay, Pastor Green said there was room for one more. Dylan had taken my mother's place, and somebody else had pulled out at the last minute. Lucky me, I concluded the call. See, I'm a great help with your sleuthing, Tara said. Just think, if I hadn't told you about the church camp, you wouldn't be going tomorrow. I'll hate it, I lamented. Tara smiled widely. It's a church camp, Laurel. What could possibly go wrong? Chapter 10. Before Basil knocked on my door with an iced coffee and a croissant, I was folding my pajamas and placing them neatly inside a suitcase. I did not have a romantic view of camping. I could not care less about bonfires and marshmallows. Sleeping under the stars seemed the sort of thing you do only when the roof has been torn off your home by a storm or some sort of gigantic radioactive lizard, and the thought of canoeing sent cold shivers down my spine. But Tom Trent, the man who liked to grow tall corn, was dead, and he certainly wasn't poisoned by his garden. Well, maybe he was, but not without human help. 2 of my suspects were going on the camping trip, Eliza Entwistle, who sat along with Tom on the committee for the Birds of Prey Church Community Garden, and Celia Watson, who also sat on the committee. While keen to keep an eye on these 2, I also needed to watch Dylan, the man possessed by my mother. My mother had never possessed a man before, either in the spiritual sense or in the natural. She was always too shrill to capture the attention of the opposite gender, and she took great pride in that little fact. I shuddered to think what was going on inside of her head now. Well, inside of Dylan's head, I supposed. I thought you could use the sustenance, Basil said as I opened the front door. And by sustenance, I meant caffeine. Same thing, I said, taking the coffee and kissing Basil on the cheek. His skin smelt like soap. In fact, his skin smelt better than soap because it also smelt like the sun. There are more than 2 food groups, you know. Basil set his car keys down on the coffee table and yawned. I took a huge gulp of coffee and felt my muscles release. Why am I going on this church camp again? I asked. Your mother is currently possessing one of her boarders, Basil replied. That seems a good enough reason as any to go on a camping trip, I should say. But bugs, I whimpered. Bugs and bears. Basil laughed. We don't have bears in Australia. Maybe I am about to discover that actually we do, in fact, have bears in Australia. And we do have crocodiles. Basil chose not to feed my hysteria. Instead, he said, in a voice warm and kind, Not this far south. What have you decided to pack? I've packed everything you're supposed to pack on a camping trip. 5 sets of pajamas, 5 pairs of slippers, 3 porcelain teacups, and a matching teapot. Basil laughed, but then he caught the expression on my face. Seriously? Why wouldn't I be serious? Basil's expression reflected concern. He walked past me and into the bedroom, where my suitcase lay open on the bed. I had actually packed 5 sets of pajamas, 5 pairs of slippers, 3 porcelain teacups, and a matching teapot. Laurel, Basil sputtered. I don't like camping, I said, in a pale effort to defend myself. What does not liking camping have to do with packing 5 sets of pajamas? They make me feel cozy. All right. Where is your tent, sleeping bag, pillow, torch, chair, table, canteen, water filter, fire starters, first aid kit, pocket knife, and compass? At the store, I replied, seeing as I have bought none of those things. You're unprepared. For camping or for life, because that statement applies to both of those things. Basil sighed. Laurel, you're not taking this seriously. I'm a little preoccupied with solving a murder and my mother's possession of Dylan Jackson. Let me run to the shop and buy you everything you need. Thank you, I replied, feeling a surge of warmth for Basil, but the bus is about to pick me up. Besides, Pastor Green said we wouldn't need to take anything. Everything will be provided for us at the camp. Do you trust him? He's Pastor Green, Basil. Is he going on the trip? Of course not. He has business to attend to here. It will only take me 20 minutes to run down to the shops. Basil's face turned red. I loved how protective he became when I was involved, but I didn't love the thought of missing the bus and letting Dylan go on the camping trip without me. The bus will be here in a minute, I said. I zipped up my suitcase, kissed Basil once on the cheek, told him to lock up after me, and practically bolted out of the funeral home. I didn't even let him carry the suitcase for me, which I knew would annoy him, but what else could I do? The bus was already outside my mother's home when I got there. I'm Tiger, the bus driver said. He offered me his hand, which was covered in tattoos of spiders. I'm your driver. I eyed him askance. Excellent. Dylan was already on the bus. We were the last people Tiger was picking up, so I took the only seat available, the one right behind the driver. A knot formed in the pit of my stomach as we drove away. Maybe I should have asked Basil to come along with me. I knew he wanted to, but also I knew he had to work. I didn't want him to lose business just because I couldn't handle a little church camping trip. After all, how bad could it be? It started raining as we drove out of town. I wondered if the camping ground was actually just ground or if there were cabins set up. Maybe I could sneak into one of them and take a hot shower and make a coffee and watch some television. Maybe I could watch The Bold and the Beautiful, if only to lock down my lie that my mother had been sent to rehab for watching too many episodes. I could hear Dylan gloating to Ian about sinners spending eternity in hell as the bus continued towards the camp. Soon, however, the rain grew too strong to hear anything besides the beating of my own heart, and Tiger singing along loudly to Waterloo by ABBA, which he replayed for the duration of the drive. When we arrived at the camping grounds, I discovered to my dismay that the word ground was literal. There were no cabins. There was no anything except for mud and spiders. I mean, I couldn't see the spiders, but I knew they were there lurking, biding their time, discussing how they would kill us in our sleep and eat our bodies. Did spiders eat bodies? I didn't know, but I was determined not to find out. "He's a wonderful young man, isn't he?" Ian said, clutching my hand as we stood next to the bus, waiting for Tiger to unload all our suitcases. "Who?" I said, pulling the hood over my head. It was only Sprinkling, but Sprinkling was bad enough. Sprinkling was frizzy hair and smudged mascara. I really did not need help smudging my mascara either, as I barely knew how to apply it in the first place. "Dylan," Ian said. Before I could reply to him, Ian had grabbed his suitcase from Tiger and was wheeling it towards a muddy clearing. "Where are you going?" I called after him. "This is where we are camping," Ian replied. "Can't we camp in a 5-star hotel?" I asked. Ian chuckled. "Oh, Laurel, you do have the best sense of humour, no matter what Thelma says." "I wasn't joking," I replied. "Ian, I wasn't joking." "You are now all unpacked," Tiger said. "I'll pick you up in 3 days." "You're leaving?" "Absolutely," Tiger said, and he hopped in the bus and closed the door. I banged on the glass. "You can't leave me here," I yelled. "You can't leave me here with these people. Look at them. They are happy. They are happy outside. I am scared." Tiger blew me a kiss and drove away. Soon I found myself huddled beneath a tree, watching Ian and Dylan laugh with each other as they set up the tents. There were 7 tents in total, each made of canvas, and they were set up in a circle. I ducked inside my tent, which I was sharing with Eliza, a possible homicidal maniac, and, I had on good authority, a snorer. Now I could put up with a murderer, but I was not about to sleep next to a snorer, which is why I had packed earplugs. They were stashed safely inside my teapot. "Laurel," Ian stuck his head inside my tent. "Laurel, come outside and partake in fellowship. Do you want to make s'mores?" "Nope." "I'll get you a marshmallow." I let Ian drag me out of the tent and shove a stick in my hand. On the stick was a marshmallow, and I could sympathize with being on the pointy end. I almost felt a little too sympathetic towards the marshmallow and didn't want to eat it. Then my stomach rumbled and I stopped caring. Ian had set up chairs around a crackling bonfire. I had to admit the fire was nice, and for a moment there I felt at peace, watching the flames crack. Then I stuck the marshmallow straight into the flames. Now, I had never been camping a day in my life. My mother liked to say that pride came before a fall, but I like to think pride helped me retain my dignity, in that pride stopped me from taking bathroom breaks in the bushland. Yes, that's the thing people who love camping don't like to address. The whole shuffling into woods in the cold of night, digging a hole among the spiders and snakes to take a bathroom break. In what world is this an acceptable, nay, enjoyable pastime? Who chooses to do that in the Aussie bush? Venomous brown snakes, that's who. Venomous brown snakes and dingoes. But that is only because they don't have indoor plumbing, or an indoors. And since I had never been camping, I was a little confused about how to make s'mores. In hindsight, holding the marshmallow above the flames seemed the common-sense move, but I was all out of common sense. I had been camping for 2 hours by then, and I was more than ready to return to civilization. Instead, I just went ahead and stuck the marshmallow straight into the coals, which meant the marshmallow caught on fire. I started to panic. I yanked the stick out of the fire and waved it around, trying to put out the marshmallow, which was emitting a tower of flames. Instead of this putting out the fire, the marshmallow flew off the stick straight into one of the tents, setting the canvas on fire. Now, until that very night, I didn't know just how quickly 7 tents standing next to each other side by side in a circle could be engulfed with flames. I guess camping was a little more educational than I had previously given camping credit for. We huddled together as the tents burnt down, and then I clapped my hands together and reached for my phone. "I guess I'll just call Tiger," I said. Then I remembered my phone was in the tent. Does anyone have a phone?" No one did. No one was mad at me either, which slightly infuriated me, actually. If Ian had accidentally set fire to our tents with an incendiary marshmallow, I'd have strangled him. So now I had no tent and no moral high ground. I hated camping. I really hated camping. "I suppose we could all huddle together," Eliza said. "It'll be an adventure." She yawned and grunted horribly. Not all adventures are good adventures, I wanted to say, but I didn't think I had the right. Instead, I said, "What fun." Then I remembered my earplugs were in the tent, gone too, along with all 5 sets of comfy pajamas. Chapter 11. I spent a sleepless night huddled together with the rest of the campers for warmth. Eliza snored the whole time, but that's not why I failed to sleep. No, I could still smell the crisp tents and the melted phones, which reminded me of my desperate shame. Who knew marshmallows could be so dangerous? And why do Americans fear Australia with our spiders and snakes when it was their s'mores burning down innocent little camps? Around dawn, and after painfully conceding that a Hemsworth brother wasn't going to burst out of the woods and carry me to safety in his massive arms, I pushed Eliza off me and stood. There wasn't much left to salvage from the camp, although I did find a half-melted chocolate bar. For a moment, I considered sharing the bar with the others. Maybe we could ration the chocolate. But then I shoved the whole thing in my mouth, sat on a log, and sobbed. Why hadn't I listened to Basil? If I'd just let him run to the shops, I would have a water filter now. I would have a pocket knife and a compass. Wait, no, those would have also burned with the tents. Laurel. It was Ian. I swallowed the chocolate and tried to look innocent. "Ian, hi." "Hello, Laurel. I wanted to thank you on behalf of the camp for the gift you have given us." "You're welcome," I said instinctively. Then, "What gift?" "I have a minor confession. In my suitcase I had packed several fine cheeses." I straightened. "I love cheese." "Limburger cheese uses Brevibacterium linens to ferment the cheese." "I love linen," I said. "It's considered one of the world's finest cheeses. But that's not all. I had also packed a certain cheese so we could have char-grilled sandwiches with sautéed mushrooms and melted Caprino Romano cheese." "But," I whimpered, "that doesn't sound like camping food." "All of that potential camping fun, all of those cheeses. Well, it made me think of Luke chapter 12, verses 32 to 34. "Sell that ye have, and give alms. Provide yourselves bags which wax not old, a treasure in the heavens that faileth not, where no thief approacheth, neither moth corrupteth. For where your treasure is, there will your heart be also." Do you see what I mean, dear? I grunted by way of response. A sanctimonious look passed over Ian's face. "We can now spend 2 more nights living a humble and honest life. We can fish, we can hunt, and we can gather water from the stream. Yes, even if we die of starvation, it will be a glorious death." This escalated very quickly. Ian beamed. "Thank you, Laurel, for showing me what is truly important. Now, let's go kill a snake." "A snake?" Ian frowned. "We have to eat, Laurel." "Let's eat the char-grilled sandwich." "Most of our supplies burnt." It's literally called a char-grilled sandwich. "Morning," Eliza said, approaching us. "What are you talking about?" "Sharpen a stick, Eliza. We're going hunting." Ian clapped his hands together and went to get the others. Eliza sat on the log beside me. "Do I want to know what that was about?" "Absolutely not," I replied. "There's a town not too far from here." "A town?" The fear in my stomach subsided a little. "A town with town things, like coffee shops." "No, it's a petrol station in the middle of nowhere, but it has coffee and food. And look, I keep my money in this bag, so it didn't burn down when you set fire to the tents." Eliza patted her bag. "I'll buy you a coffee. We'll tell Ian we went hunting and keep this our little secret. What do you say, Laurel?" I didn't care if she was the murderer. I loved her. I would help her flee the police, change her name, start a new life. 3 hours later, we arrived back at camp, caffeinated and fed. The petrol station had been tiny, but to me it felt like a wonderful oasis. "We had no luck finding a snake," I told Ian, trying to look sad. "Better luck next time, I guess. Did you happen to catch a snake?" "No, but we found something better. We've been licking the moss of trees," Ian told me. "Isn't that wonderful?" "Superb." "Now we're nourished," Dylan said. "Why don't we all sit in a circle, hold hands, and sing?" "Yes," Celia said. "That sounds like a marvelous idea." Does it? I thought, but I didn't say anything. I could still smell the crispy tents, so the guilt was too real. At least it wasn't raining today. "Your skin looks lovely today, Celia," I said instead. She glared at me. "Yes, well, I use a very expensive face cream. It is my one vanity. It costs $300, and I have it sent from Paris. That is in France." "I know where Paris is, actually." "It's made from organic aloe vera." "That's nice." Celia nodded. "It is rather. Thankfully, I saved my jar from the tent before your actions," she glared at me even harder, "made everything burn down." I might just study some trees," I said, knowing this would please Celia, who loved trees. However, she didn't seem that impressed, pursing her lips as she watched me slowly walk backwards into the woods. I knew I needed to keep an eye on Dylan, but truthfully, I was so over camping. The petrol station's landline had been out of order, and they didn't have mobile service, so I hadn't been able to borrow a phone. I was stuck here until Tiger returned. I wondered if Basil and I were somehow linked, like twins who can feel when something happens to their sibling. I once knew a girl who felt a sharp stab in her stomach when her sister's appendix burst. Maybe I just needed my appendix to burst, and then Basil would feel it and come racing to my rescue. Not that I needed a man to rescue me, unless he was that aforementioned Hemsworth brother. For a Hemsworth brother, a girl does like to make an exception. I looked around. It was too much to hope that there was a secret, glorious bathroom hidden somewhere close. I had come here not to relieve myself, but to breathe. Breathe. How hard is fresh air to come by in the Aussie bush? Apparently very hard, even more so when you have a group of people loudly singing Kumbaya amongst the charred remains of their campsite. I pulled down my knickers and squatted over what I hoped was not an ant's nest. Or any other type of nest, really. No animal, not even a spider, deserved to see my giant looming bottom right above their quaint little home. "Laurel?" I got such a shock overhearing my name, I fell backwards, right into a patch of what I hoped was grass. Good, old-fashioned grass, nothing more. "Laurel?" It was Dylan. He peered down at me with my mother's judgmental eyes. "A little privacy, please," I whimpered, yanking up my pants and standing. "Is everything okay?" "Why are you sitting in a patch of stinging nettle?" he asked me. It turned out I had fallen bottom first into a patch of stinging nettle. Suddenly, I was in agony. I looked around, searching desperately for something which would relieve the pain. "My bottom is on fire!" I screamed. "Were you drinking? I bet you were drinking." "I wasn't drinking," I said, both sets of cheeks, face and bottom, burning. Dylan replied. "Help me." "You need aloe vera," he said. "Yes, aloe vera will help take the sting out of stinging nettle." "Where do I find aloe vera around here?" "It's in a lot of skincare," Dylan replied. "Not that I would ever use skincare. Vanity is one of the 7 deadly sins, you know." "Fine. Yes, vanity. Okay, but I need aloe vera." It was then I remembered Celia used expensive skincare cream loaded with aloe vera, and that the skincare had not been destroyed in the fire. I turned away from Dylan and bolted towards the campsite. I had to find Celia. I had to rub her expensive skincare cream all over my burning bottom, or else I would surely die. "Laurel, whatever's the matter, dear?" Ian asked as I burst into their kumbaya circle. "Where's Celia?" "She's doing her skincare routine," Ian said. "Personally, I believe a skincare routine is vain, but it's not up to me to judge her vanity." I pointed my finger in his face. "Yada, yada, yada. Where is she?" "Laurel, are you okay?" Eliza asked. "Who cares? Where is Celia? I need to find Celia. Why is no one helping me find that old witch?" I cried. Ian shrugged. "I think she's by the river, dear." I shouldered past him like a rugby player and sprinted for the river. How did I let this happen? How did I let myself fall bottom first into a patch of stinging nettle? Was I cursed? Did my ancestors loot an ancient tomb? Did my great-great-great-grandfather break the heart of a hermit who lives in a garden before he died of tuberculosis and she cursed his descendants? Surely my life could not be this awful for absolutely no reason. Wasn't there someone I could hold accountable? Of course, I could have held myself accountable, but where is the fun in that? The stinging grew progressively worse as I ran through the bushes. It was rocky, and there was no path, and I think I heard bats in the trees above me. I could definitely smell bats in the trees above me. I wondered if I could scare one and let it bite me, just so I could die of some bat-related disease. Dead people don't have to worry about stealing skincare to save themselves from death by stinging. "Celia!" I yelled as I crashed into the river. The cool water did nothing to help, so I dragged myself onto the shore and looked around through my tears. I spotted Celia in no time. She was sitting on a rock, her feet dipped into the water, humming as she rubbed the skincare cream on her face. She looked so peaceful, so happy, and I was about to ruin everything. "Celia, I need to use your skincare product," I shrieked, charging over to her rock. "Please, I can explain later. It's an emergency." "Laurel," Celia said. She looked as though she could not believe her eyes. Without a word, I yanked the skincare jar out of her hands and pushed her into the river. I didn't mean to push her into the river, really. I just couldn't take the chance she would snatch the jar back out of my hands before I had a chance to soothe my stinging bottom. "Laurel?" It turned out Ian, Dylan, Eliza, and the other church camp members had all followed me down to the river. Yes, they looked completely shocked that I had pushed Celia into the water, but they looked even more shocked when I pulled my knickers down and slathered the Parisian skincare cream all over my bare bottom. Ah, Parisians. They really do know what they are doing when it comes to beauty, if not food. Snails? Frogs? No thank you. But within a second of rubbing their expensive cream all over my throbbing skin, the stinging stopped and I was free from the pain. And also my dignity. "What on earth is wrong with you?" Celia yelled as Dylan helped her out of the river. "I've been drinking," I lied. Dylan clapped his hands together. I knew it. Chapter 12. Now that the stinging had entirely subsided, I was horribly embarrassed I had flashed all the camp members. I traipsed behind them through the lightly falling rain as we made our way back to the campsite. "Idle hands are the devil's workshop," Ian announced when we arrived at the camp. "Luckily, the costumes were stacked under a tree and were not burnt." "What costumes?" I asked. "Didn't you know?" Ian said. "Every year at church camp we do a nativity scene." "But it's not Christmas," I protested. Ian ignored me. "And in good news, we found that the cans of baked beans weren't ruined by the fire. Let's all have a big feast before the play." I didn't really care what they did. I was just happy that my bottom was no longer causing me excruciating agony. I was even able to sit on it. Soon we were sitting around the campfire, the rain drizzling lightly, but not enough to put out the flames, and Ian was opening cans of baked beans with a can opener covered in soot from the flames, but still in working order. He handed everybody a can and a spoon. The cutlery had likewise survived the fire. I sat and happily munched on baked beans while Ian chatted to everybody about the play. "I don't know what we can do for the scenery now, since it's all burnt." He shot me a pointed look. "Can't we improvise?" I asked. I thought Ian would protest, but he clasped his hands together with glee. "Excellent. We just need to make a manger, and we can do that with branches and bushes, and we can gather bracken fern fronds. Yes, I'm sure there's plenty of raw material in the bushes." "Who's going to play the donkeys behind this year?" Celia asked. Ian tapped his chin. "Oh, that's right. Cyril couldn't come this year. I know. What about you, Dylan?" "The donkeys behind," Dylan repeated thoughtfully. "Yes, we have a donkey costume. I always play the front of the donkey, and we need someone to play the behind of the donkey." "I guess I'd be happy to be a donkey's bottom." Dylan's face lit up in a wide smile, which turned to a grimace. He clutched his stomach. "I don't feel so well. Maybe I licked too much tree moss." He handed Ian his can of baked beans. "You can have mine." Ian held up both hands in front of him to protest. "I couldn't possibly take your food, Dylan." "Please do. I simply cannot look at baked beans." "Oh, well, if you insist." Ian snatched the can of baked beans from Dylan and scoffed the contents in double-quick time. "When will you be doing the church play?" I asked Ian. "No time like the present," he said. "We have nothing else to do." "Okay." Eliza stood up. "First of all, we should collect everything we need for the props. Laurel, who will you play?" "A spectator?" I said hopefully. She looked doubtful, but then said, "I suppose we could do with one more spectator. Besides, we have everybody. The baby Jesus, Mary and Joseph, the 3 wise men, and the donkey." I breathed a sigh of relief. Celia loomed over me. "We don't have any sheep. Maybe Laurel could be a sheep." "We don't have a sheep costume," Ian protested. Celia shot me a malevolent look. "I'm sure we could find something." She narrowed her eyes at me. "I know. What about dandelions? Laurel can crouch on her hands and knees without moving, and we can pile dandelion stalks on her. The white, fluffy dandelion heads will give the impression of wool." I made to protest, but then thought I had better hold my tongue. After all, I had plastered her expensive French face cream on my bottom, so I owed her one. If she wanted revenge, then so be it. I just hoped she wasn't the murderer and would try to poison me. I made a mental note not to eat any cans of baked beans that hadn't been opened directly in front of me. Soon I found myself back amongst the eucalyptus trees, this time pulling down small branches. There was plenty of stinging nettle around the bottom of the trees, but now I knew what it looked like, and I wasn't going to go anywhere near it. I returned to the camp and set down my pile of eucalyptus leaves alongside the collection of wattles, bottle brushes, and wide strips of bark from stringy bark trees. Ian soon busied himself making a framework, or a backdrop, as he called it, for the play. I didn't think it looked particularly sturdy, but I wasn't about to comment. Before long, the church play was underway. Ian and Dylan had somehow poured themselves into the donkey costume. I was on my hands and knees, in place as the representative sheep. I was doing my best not to sneeze at the cascading dandelions, and also doing my best not to laugh at Ian and Dylan in the donkey costume. As they approached the backdrop, I saw Eliza, who was playing Mary, walking with them. I figured she couldn't actually hop on the makeshift donkey because she would have done them some damage. I supposed she was improvising. Every few seconds, an explosive sound emanated from the donkey. Each time, the sound coincided with Eliza stepping away from the donkey and a scream coming from within the costume. As they approached, I realized what the sound was. Ian had eaten more cans of baked beans than anybody else, and Dylan was on the receiving end of it, no pun intended. They finally reached the big backdrop, and Eliza, who had stuffed branches under her clothes to make herself look pregnant, staggered over to Joseph, who was already sitting in the manger. I thought that wasn't quite how the story went, and I couldn't see an innkeeper, but I kept my opinions to myself. Joseph, who was played by a man I hadn't met, made a long and particularly boring speech. When it mercifully came to an end, Mary, aka Eliza, sat down in a pile of stringy bark next to the manger. The donkey edged closer. The explosive sound came again. It was followed by another little yell, but this time Dylan must have made to stand up, because the donkey's back arched and the costume fell into two pieces. Both men lurched wildly into the backdrop as the costume fell down around Dylan's legs. Ian was face down in the mud, and Dylan was lying on top of him. I abandoned my position as a sheep and went over to help them up. Well, I never, Ian said over and over again. Such an abomination! How ungodly! What's ungodly? Celia said. I was glad she was as confused as I was. Ian trembled. Leviticus chapter 18, verse 22. Thou shalt not lie with mankind. I'm sure it wasn't referring to what just happened here, I told him. Ian's face scrunched in confusion. Whatever do you mean? Just then I heard my mother's voice. Ian is right, Laurel. How dare you question him? I spun around. Dylan was standing there, his hands on his hips, looking for all the world like my mother. Well, he still looked like himself, but his mannerisms were those of my mother. Everybody hurried over to him. What's wrong, Dylan? Eliza asked, giving him a little shake. Why are you calling me Dylan? Mum's voice said. Chapter 13. Angus Trent was sitting opposite me in my office, discussing his father's funeral. I had the gig because I owned the only funeral home in town, and Angus had made sure to tell me that was the reason. I had never met his father, but from what I'd heard he was an unpleasant man, and I am certain Angus was equally unpleasant. He yawned widely and grunted before shooting me a sheepish look. Jet lag. I rubbed my forehead. And you say the police have agreed to release your father's body? He nodded vigorously. Yes, that's right. They said they have no further use for it. Miss Bay, my father and I weren't close. I lived in Europe and didn't see much of him. All that aside, I would like him to have a nice funeral. That's what we're in the business of here, nice funerals, I said automatically. I opened my mouth to say something else, but he cut me off. The man at the morgue told me you do themed funerals. I eyed him warily. That's right. What did you have in mind?
Can you come up with an idea for a garden-themed funeral?
I took a deep breath and exhaled slowly. Well, you see, the clients come to me with their ideas, and I just see to it that their ideas are carried out. I myself don't come up with the ideas. He glared at me and then flung his hands to the ceiling.
But surely you must have an idea for a garden-themed funeral. What if everybody comes dressed as vegetables, or plants in general?
I stared him down. It's entirely up to you how you would like your guests to dress, because you would need to request that of them, I said in a firm voice. However, I can make sure the chapel is decorated with plenty of plants. I heard your father was very fond of corn, so maybe I could place corn around, that sort of thing.
I didn't feel the least creative. I thought he was going to object, so added,
Will Pastor Green be officiating? Your father was involved with the church garden club.
That's a good idea. I hadn't even thought about it. Could you ask him for me?
I nodded. Sure, I'd be happy to do that. Pastor Green is also quite happy to dress up for the themed funerals. I could ask him to come as a vegetable, and you could ask all the guests to come as vegetables. There is a very good costume shop in town. And when would you like the funeral to be held?
Tomorrow.
Tomorrow? I repeated. He narrowed his eyes.
Is that too soon?
No, so long as we can have your father brought over here in time for the cosmetician. I'll make some calls and arrange it.
Thank you. I'm in a hurry to get back to Europe as soon as I can.
Won't you have to stay here and sort out your father's estate? I asked him. He looked startled, like a kangaroo caught in the headlights.
Oh, yes. It should be straightforward, at least the initial aspect, but I can't leave the country permanently until probate is through. That will take months. I'll stay here and sort out the things in my father's house first, then fly back to Europe, and then fly back here again when probate has been granted.
Okay, then. I'll leave you to sort out the order of the service with Pastor Green.
Angus cut me off. Look, I don't know how to say this without coming across as cold, but my father and I had quite a horrible relationship. He was verbally abusive to me as a child, to be frank. I left for Europe as soon as I was old enough and had the money to leave. We've barely spoken for years, and not until recently. I had kept in touch with him more over the last year or two to try to reconcile, just to do the right thing.
Alarm bells went off in my head. If Angus didn't have a rock-solid alibi, I would think he had tried to rekindle the relationship with his father as part of his plan to murder him and inherit everything. I silently berated myself for being so cynical. The police had checked into Angus's alibi. It must have been just a coincidence he had rekindled things in time to be the sole heir, and maybe even if he hadn't made amends, his father would have left him everything anyway. I looked up to see Angus staring at me.
Miss May?
I'm sorry, I was thinking about your father. Did you say something?
Yes, I've never organised a funeral before. What do I need to do next? I'm afraid you will have to guide me through everything.
The first thing you need to do is choose a casket. I slid some glossy brochures across to him, and a price list as well. There you go. There's a huge range there, and the prices are on this page. I tapped my hand on the black and white page. There are some nice, relatively new caskets too. They're environmentally friendly and made of cardboard.
His eyes lit up. Cardboard? Yes, I'll have one of those.
But they're not cheap, I warned him. It was apparent to me he had chosen cardboard because he thought it was a cheap option. I pressed on. They're quite beautiful. Some of them come with lovely designs on them, or you could have whatever you like on them. For example, because your father liked plants so much, you could have a design with plants. I suddenly stopped and tapped my head. Oh, how silly of me. These take 2 weeks to make, but if you wanted a ready-made one, it would take longer. As the service is tomorrow, you need something that is already in town. His face fell.
And you don't sell any?
Only this range here. I pulled a brochure out from a drawer and showed him the range.
That's quite a bargain price,
he said after staring at the brochure for a lengthy interval.
I'll have this one here. It's the cheapest, but it doesn't actually look cheap. I don't want any gold or brass additions like plaques or crosses or anything."
"That's fine," I said. "Will it be an open or a closed casket?"
"Closed," he said firmly. "I don't want to see my father, and I doubt anyone else does. Is it cheaper?"
Now I was confused. Is what cheaper? Is a closed casket service cheaper than an open casket service? No, they're the same price. The cosmetician doesn't charge any extra for an open casket. He seemed to be thinking that over. I added, "Is there anything you would like buried with him? And what clothes would you like him buried in? Did he have a favorite suit or anything like that?"
"No. Bury him in whatever you like. What else do I have to do? I've chosen the coffin and you're going to speak to the pastor. Can you speak to the morgue and get them to bring his body here?"
"Sure," I said absently. It suddenly dawned on me that along with the body could come the ghost. This would give me a good opportunity to question the victim as to who he thought murdered him. Angus was still talking.
"I want him cremated. That's cheaper, isn't it?"
"Yes, it is," I said. "You're right. Now you just have to choose an urn for his ashes."
"I'm going to scatter his ashes on his garden," he said. "I can't take them back to Europe with me, and he liked flowers. I won't need an urn."
"Then what will we use to hold his ashes?" I asked him. For the first time, I noticed he had 2 green shopping bags with him. He reached into one and pulled out an empty Vegemite jar.
"Will this do?"
He pushed it across the table. I was quite taken aback. "Sure, I suppose," I said. "It's certainly a first. Was your father fond of Vegemite?"
"I have no idea. He was fond of women in his youth, but that's as much as I know. Now, is that all?"
I stood up. "Yes, but I'll show you around the chapel before you leave." When we arrived in the chapel, I added, "As it's a plant, specifically a vegetable-themed funeral, we could put lots of vegetables around. It might look a bit cheesy, but a vegetable-themed funeral might look a bit cheesy anyway," I said to him. He yawned again.
"Yes, whatever you think. Thank you."
The landline in my office rang. "I'll be right back." I hurried back to the office, but the phone stopped just as my fingers touched it. I rolled my eyes and headed back into the chapel. Angus was fast asleep and snoring in the most ghastly fashion, sounding like a freight train and making the whole seat shake. Chapter 14.
"Tom Trench's ghost is a nasty piece of work,"
Ernie said. "You can't get anything out of him?" Ernie shook his head.
"I can't repeat what he said. It would make your hair stand on end. The censored version is that he's not going to help us solve his murder. He doesn't like your mother, Laurel, and he knows the police suspect her. He said he'd rather the police arrest your mother than catch the real perpetrator."
I scratched my head. Why on earth would he say that? I was entirely perplexed.
"Beats me. You know, I've never met such an obnoxious spirit. Please hurry up and solve his murder so he can go on to the other side. He's no fun at all, that one."
"But there's a clue there, Ernie, don't you see?" Ernie looked blank, so I added, "Perhaps he feels his murder was justified."
Ernie snorted rudely. "Or perhaps he simply didn't like your mother."
I nodded slowly. But what if it was one of the neighbors he'd tried to extort the fence money from? He might feel the murder was justified in that case.
"Are you quite mad?" Ernie said. "Murdered over a fence? No, it has to be something more than that."
"I think Laurel is onto something," Basil said. I didn't hear Ernie's reply, because by then Basil and I had walked into my apartment, and Ernie couldn't get past the spiritual barricade I had placed at the door. We carried bags of ice to my bathtub. "This is a bad idea," I said to Basil.
"I agree with you," he said, "but what else can we do? We can't leave your mother in the mortuary cabinet because Janet will probably look in there. We can't risk it. We'll just have to keep Thelma on ice until Tom Trent's funeral is over. I shivered. I had the air conditioning in the apartment turned down as cold as I could get it. The bathtub was full of ice. Basil and I had put more bags of ice in my kitchen sink and in my fridge, ready to dump on Mum when we brought her upstairs. I'll go and fetch her, Basil said. Will you be able to carry her up the stairs yourself? I asked. I don't really want to look at her, but I will help you if you need it. I'll wheel her on the trolley to the stairs, and I should be okay from there, Basil said. You go and make sure Janet doesn't come early. I hurried down the stairs and stood at the front door. Ernie, can you go outside and let me know if you see a car coming? Ernie nodded and floated through the wall. I leant back against the door, my heart beating out of my chest. This was an absolute nightmare. I had to keep Mum's body alive and on ice, and Janet would be here soon to prepare the body. I could not shake the most horrible feeling something was going to go wrong. When I heard the trolley coming, I clamped my hands firmly over my eyes. I can't look, I called to Basil. That's all right. Keep your eyes shut until I come back down. Basil's tone was calm and reassuring. I heard the trolley stop, and I heard Basil's feet go up the stairs. I took my hand away from my eyes in time to see Ernie floating through the wall. Janet's on her way, he announced with a flourish. I hurried over to the apartment door. Basil, Janet's coming. Can you hear me? Yes, I'll be down as soon as I finish. I'll take the trolley back, I yelled. I pushed the trolley back to the preparation room as fast as I could and then sprinted back to the door. I made it with seconds to spare. Laurel, you look breathless. Have you been working out? Yes, I've been running up and down the corridor to try to lose weight, I said for a joke. It's not working yet. Janet pushed past me. Janet had the most unfortunate problem in that she always said what she thought. She didn't mean to be unkind, so I tried not to be offended. You don't have to do a fabulous job on Tom Trent because he's going to be cremated, I told her. She looked at me aghast. But Laurel, you know I always have to make my clients look wonderful, and this time I don't have much time. Why you didn't let me come last night to work on him is beyond me. I had no ready reply. Instead, I waved her on. Yes, you're right, you don't have much time. No time like the present. I made shooing motions with my hands. Janet hurried away from me. I sprinted to my apartment and locked the door behind me. I took the steps two at a time. Basil was walking away from the direction of my bathroom. Okay, your mother is all settled in. How did she look? I said. Did she look all right? Basil frowned. Laurel, she's dead. Yes, but is she okay? I mean, for a dead person. She doesn't look damaged or anything. Basil continued to frown. She looks very well for a dead person. Don't you worry about anything. We just have to keep her on ice and hope this funeral doesn't last too long so we can get her back to the mortuary cabinet. And hopefully Dylan will soon be relaxed enough so your mother's spirit can return to his body. Yes, I wonder why that hasn't happened yet, I said. My hand flew to my throat. Basil, what if Ernie was wrong? What if my mother really is dead, as in fully dead, never to be undead, permanently dead, for real? Basil put his arm around me and drew me close. No, Laurel, I'm sure Ernie's right. We do know for certain that your mother's spirit possessed Dylan. Ernie was right about that, so it stands to reason he was right about the rest of it as well. I rubbed my eyes with my left hand. Okay, I suppose that makes sense. I walked over to my oil diffuser and sniffed it deeply. What are you doing? I spun around. I'm stressed. I put a lot of lavender essential oil in my diffuser so the smell can calm me. I took a deep breath and let it out slowly. I had better get the funeral ready. Anyway, thanks for everything, as usual, Basil. He bent down and kissed my forehead. I'll get back to work. Don't lose your new phone. Call me about half an hour before you think you'll be ready for me, so I can get here in a timely fashion, and take your mother back downstairs."
I thanked him again.
As soon as he left, I wasted no time putting the finishing touches on the chapel. I had arranged baskets of vegetables around the room. Angus had been conspicuous by his absence. I had hoped he would bring some vegetables or do something, anything, to contribute to the decorating. I was somewhat irritated that he hadn't bothered. No flowers had been delivered, so I had cut branches off the 2 Tiburtina trees outside, as well as other flowering shrubs, and placed the flowing branches all around the room. I had raided Mum's garden and put large vases of flowers all around the room. When Janet wheeled the coffin out, she helped me arrange native flowers on top of it. Bottle brushes, wattles, lily-pillies, and the long golden flowers of the desert flame. I stood back to admire our handiwork.
"Don't you think it's strange?"
Janet asked me. What? That the victim's son wanted a plant-themed funeral?
"Yes, considering his father was killed by plants."
I tapped my chin. You know, I didn't even think of that. Well, he wasn't killed by vegetables, and it's not as if we put vases of wolfsbane around the chapel.
"That's a shame, as it's such a pretty flower," Janet said. "I grow it. Maybe I could go and fetch some of it."
"Maybe that's not such a good idea," I said, making a mental note to keep on her good side and wondering what I would do if she insisted. Luckily, she did not.
"I doubt many people will attend Tom Trent's funeral," she said.
"Yes, I haven't found anyone who has a good word to say about him yet." Janet readily agreed.
"Although he probably has enough illegitimate children to fill the town."
"Illegitimate children?" I said. "What makes you say that?" Janet rolled her eyes and sighed.
"Honestly, Laurel, put 2 and 2 together," she chuckled. "Tom had quite the reputation back in the day. He even dated my mother at one point. He dated most of the women in town, except probably your mother, Laurel. I mean, who would want to date her?"
She pulled a face.
"He dated married women, too. I really wouldn't be surprised if he has plenty of illegitimate children in the town."
"Then maybe they don't know he's their real father," I said.
"Perhaps, because he mostly had affairs with married women."
"So whatever happened to his wife?" Janet raised her eyebrows.
"What? No, he was never married. My mother told me he said he'd never get married."
"I hope someone turns up for the funeral then, apart from you and me and his son." Janet chuckled.
"There's Pastor Green as well, and people from the church."
"Oh, yes, the church people," I said. I had forgotten that people from the Birds of Prey church would come even if they couldn't stand Tom. That meant Ian would come, and the ghastly John Jones who had taken a liking to me. It was most certainly not mutual. However, Janet, for some inexplicable reason, seemed to have a crush on John Jones. Right on cue, as if she knew what I was thinking, Janet said,
"I expect John Jones will come."
"I expect he will," I said, without any enthusiasm. Janet checked her watch.
"Pastor Green should be here any minute."
I walked to the front door, and sure enough, Pastor Green was heading across from the parking area. He was dressed in colours of brown and green, and was wearing a hat with twigs sticking out of it, and was clutching a potato. I chuckled. "Thanks so much for coming as a plant," I said. "I did go to the costume shop, but they said they'd all sold out," he said. "This was the best I could do." "It's awfully nice of you to go along with all these themed funerals." He smiled widely and stepped inside. Janet walked over to him.
"Is John Jones coming?"
"Yes, several people are coming. I was hoping to get here earlier to get things sorted out, but I was delayed. They shouldn't be far behind me." Janet continued to chat to Pastor Green while I walked to stand at the door. Angus was the next to arrive. He was dressed as a giant cucumber. At least, that's what I thought it was. "Nice costume," I lied. He took my hand and pumped it enthusiastically. "Thank you." I waved my hand in the direction of the chapel. "Pastor Green is already there. Why don't you go in and discuss things with him?" Angus scowled at me and strolled away. Ian arrived with John Jones and Dylan. Ian was wearing a flower pot on his head with a stalk sticking out of the top, and Dylan was wearing one of my mother's hats which he had made into a toadstool or a mushroom. I wasn't quite sure which. It was round, at least. John Jones was dressed in a sensible suit and was clutching a bouquet of cherry tomatoes.
"Laurel, I see you're not dressed as a plant,"
he greeted me. "And nor are you, John," I said, pointing out the obvious. He winked at me. I shuddered. "Please go in," I said. "The service is about to start." Some more people trickled in, people I recognized from the prayer meeting the other night. Some people carried bunches of herbs, while others had made hats with plants adorning them. Others were dressed in costumes from the local costume shop, sporting costumes such as peas, pickles, and onions. I waited at the front door until I could hear the service starting. With everyone safely in the chapel, I thought I should check on Mum. I wasn't going to look at her face, but I wanted to tip some more ice over her in the bathtub. I walked up the stairs and flipped on the coffee machine. I thought I might as well wait up here while the service was proceeding and have a quick coffee before slipping back down to wait at the back of the chapel. I fetched a bag of ice from the kitchen sink and walked into the bathroom. I could see Mum's feet, so I put one hand over my eyes and edged closer to her. I opened the bag and tipped the ice up and down, keeping my eyes firmly on her feet. A blood-curdling scream pierced the air. I spun around. There was John Jones, as white as a ghost.
"Laurel, your mother is dead!"
He put his hands to his head and screamed again.
"You killed her!"
Chapter 15. John Jones stood in the doorway, transfixed in horror, his face pale, his hands raised skyward.
"Your mother!"
he screamed again.
"She's not in rehab. She's dead."
"That's not my mother. That's her twin sister, and you're embarrassing her. Out of the bathroom now." I injected as much authority into my voice as I could muster. John Jones just stood there, so I pushed him out of the bathroom and shut the door behind us. I thought fast and said the first thing that came to my mind. "That's my mother's twin sister. She's here having a beauty treatment. Ice is good for beauty therapy. And John, how dare you burst into my private apartment and into my private bathroom? What if my aunt had been naked?" Going on the offensive seemed to do the trick.
I called out to you, but you didn't hear me, so I followed you,"
he sputtered. I crossed my arms over my chest. "This is my apartment, John, my private apartment. You have no right to enter a lady's residence without her permission, much less go to her bathroom. Why, what must my poor aunt think?"
"She did look frozen in shock,"
he admitted. If only he knew. "Thankfully, she insisted on taking the ice treatment with her clothes on," I said. I moved John into the living room, as far away from the bathroom as I could manage.
"But Thelma said she doesn't have a sister."
John Jones shot me an accusatory look. "Of course she has a sister," I scoffed, pointing to the bathroom. "You saw her for yourself." He jutted out his bottom lip.
"Then why did Thelma tell me she didn't have a sister?"
"She's embarrassed about her sister," I said. "Her sister is—" My voice trailed away. I tried to think of something that would embarrass my mother. There should be a plethora of things, but under the stress of the moment, my mind went blank. After an interval, I added, "I'm too embarrassed to tell you." John Jones narrowed his eyes and then said,
"Does her sister listen to rock music?"
"That's it," I said with relief. "But please don't tell anybody. My mother is quite distressed about it." He nodded slowly.
"No wonder Thelma was too scared to tell me."
"Aunt Louise came here to have a quiet time, and I don't want the police to know she's here. They've been giving us all the third degree about Mum. If the detectives know Aunt Louise is here, they'll take her in for questioning."
"The police question me, too,"
John said. "Yes, and I don't want them to upset my aunt."
Please don't tell the police that Aunt Louise is staying with me. Will you give me your word?"
John's demeanour changed, and he shot me a judgmental look.
"You know I can't lie, Laurel. Liars don't inherit the kingdom of God."
"Neither, I'm sure, do people who invade a lady's privacy. Okay then, let's make a deal. If the police ask you if my mother's sister, Louise, is staying with me, then feel free to tell them that she is. But if they don't specifically ask you that, you won't volunteer the information. Do we have a deal?" John rubbed his eyes with both hands, but then said,
"I think that's all right."
"And you can't tell Ian either. It will have to be our little secret, John." John shot me a sickening smile. I thought I would throw up.
"I like having secrets with you, Laurel."
I put my hands on my hips. "Never enter my apartment again without my permission. Do you understand, John?" He nodded, but did not appear the slightest bit apologetic. "Anyway, why did you come here? Why did you want to speak with me?"
"I wanted to ask if you were still dating Basil."
I was furious. "Yes, John, I'm still dating Basil. Now please leave my apartment at once." John hurried back down the stairs. I followed him and made sure I locked the apartment door this time. I slumped onto the steps and put my head in my hands. That was a close call, and if it had been anyone else, they wouldn't have believed my ridiculous story. John Jones was one of the few people who would believe such a thing. What was I to do? Should I call Basil? No. I took a few deep breaths and sprinted back up my stairs. I looked in on Mum again, but was only able to look at her feet. I fetched the other bag of ice out of the sink and tipped it over her. I went back to the funeral. To my surprise, the pastor was already summing up. I figured it was a short service because there was no one to give the eulogy, apart from Angus, that is. I cast a look around the room. Apart from Angus and Dylan, they were all church people. I hurried into the side room to make sure the hot water urn was boiling. I fetched the lamingtons from the fridge and uncovered all the other cakes. I had been surprised that Angus had been willing to pay for the food. Maybe he wanted to put on a good show for the police. It was only then did I notice the police. Detective Prescott and Detective Packwood were standing at the back of the room. I wondered when they had arrived. Detective Prescott greeted me at once.
"You haven't heard from your mother?"
"No, I haven't heard from her at all," I said. "Have you asked Ian? She would call him well before she'd ever call me." Detective Prescott simply nodded to me, while Packwood shot me a suspicious look. I walked to the other side of the room and watched as people piled in. Celia was chatting with Angus. I edged closer to overhear what they were saying.
"As much as I couldn't stand your father, I'm sorry he's gone,"
Celia said.
"but only for your sake."
Angus snorted.
"Don't be sorry for my sake. There was no love lost between us."
Yes, I figured that since you spent so long in Europe,
Celia said. They both turned around and saw me looking, so I thrust a plate of cupcakes under their noses. "Cupcake, anyone?"
No thanks, I'm celiac,
Celia said. I gestured to the plate at the end of the table. "I do have some gluten-free chocolate chip cookies over there. They're dairy-free and egg-free too."
Are you absolutely certain they're gluten-free?
Celia asked me.
Can I see the packet?
"Sure, come with me." I led her to the rubbish bin and retrieved the packet. I expected her to read the label, but as soon as she saw it, she said,
"Oh yes, I buy those for myself from Woolies. I hope you didn't think it was a strange thing for me to ask."
I hurried to reassure her. "Not at all. Allergies and intolerances obviously have serious consequences." She nodded.
Yes, Eliza Entwistle invited me over to her place for dinner, and she invited Russell too. I told her we were both celiac, but she fed us something with gluten, and we were both sick for days.
I was horrified. "Are you saying she did it deliberately?" I blurted out without thinking. Celia frowned deeply.
Well, I wouldn't say that. Actually, I have no idea,
But I did go to great lengths to tell her we were celiac. I also offered to bring some of my own food, but she wouldn't hear of it. Luckily, I always take activated charcoal tablets in my handbag and also gluten-blocking enzyme tablets, or it would have been much worse.
With that, Celia went back to the table to fetch a plate, and on it deposited several of the gluten-free chocolate chip cookies. I wondered about Eliza. Did she have a grudge against Celia or Russell, or could the three of them have been in it together? They all held a grudge against the victim. Upon reflection, I dismissed the thought. No, if they were good friends, then Eliza wouldn't have given Celia and Russell gluten-containing foods, whether deliberately or accidentally. My head was spinning, so I walked over to the urn and made myself a cup of black tea. I really wanted coffee, but Angus's budget only ran to the instant stuff, and I had the real stuff upstairs in my apartment. I fervently wished everyone would leave soon so I could call Basil and we could get Mum back into the mortuary cabinet. I looked over at Janet, who was talking with John Jones. I hoped he would keep his mouth shut about Mum. The detectives were observing everybody there, and I was disconcerted to see Detective Packwood was observing me in particular. I had almost forgotten about Dylan, but he appeared beside me.
Laurel, you shouldn't be eating so many of those cookies. You're not getting any thinner, you know.
I rounded on him.
Stop it, Mum, I said.
I realized what I had said and looked around. Dylan had already turned away and was selecting cookies. Ian appeared beside me.
Poor Dylan. You shouldn't encourage him, dear.
Don't call me dear, I snapped. Besides, he did a good imitation of my mother's voice, so I thought it was her. Obviously, he is not my mother.
Yes, the poor man, Ian said. Being struck by lightning and then eating that tree moss has obviously affected his mind. It has also made him most ungodly, now that he is wearing women's clothes.
You are most ungodly too, Ian, I told him.
Ian gasped.
How could you say such a thing?
It looks as though you're wearing a polyester and wool blend, and the Bible says you shouldn't do that.
Ian laughed.
Don't be so silly, Laurel. That doesn't count.
You're saying the Bible doesn't count? I countered.
This time he did look a little taken aback.
Yes, of course it all counts. Just not that bit. That's not relevant for today.
I'd had this argument with my mother, and I knew logic wouldn't get me anywhere. Whatever. I looked over at Dylan, who was now sitting on a chair knitting, his legs crossed primly. He was wearing a sensible tweed skirt with a sensible tweed blazer and a string of pearls. However, the shade of lipstick did not go with his complexion. Detective Packwood appeared at my shoulder.
I heard Dylan Jackson ate psychotropic herbs when you were camping.
I believe so, I said. Ian tells me it was moss from trees. It didn't seem to affect the others, though. Ian thinks it's a combination of being struck by lightning and eating the moss. Maybe Dylan did eat some magic mushrooms and didn't know it. I gave a half shrug.
Has he seen a doctor?
Not as far as I know. He doesn't think anything's wrong. He thinks he's a woman.
Specifically, he thinks he is your mother.
Yes. I had a feeling I was walking into a trap, but I couldn't see how.
How would he know what your mother was like if he had never met her?
Packwood asked me. I wondered if the detectives suspected my mother was hiding in the house and had met Dylan. Dylan has become best friends with Ian, so I assume Ian told him all about Mum, I said. Why don't you ask him if he's ever met my mother? Detective Packwood simply narrowed his eyes and walked away. Thankfully, most of the church people had started to drift away.
That was a good service, Laurel, Angus said. Thanks for that.
I'm happy you were pleased with it, I said. How long are you staying in town?
Just until I sort out Dad's house and everything else. At first I thought it would only take a few days, but now I think it will take a few weeks.
Well, good luck with it all. Angus nodded and made his way out. The detectives and Dylan were the last to leave. They walked out of the door, chatting with him.
I immediately called Basil and asked him to get here as fast as he could. This was all going downhill fast. Dylan seemed happy enough, but Mum's spirit had not left him yet. She was frozen in my bathtub and would have to go back into the mortuary cabinet for goodness knows how long. I was no closer to finding the murderer. What was I to do? Everyone had left, so I walked up to the front door to lock it, but just as I did, a ghost appeared in front of me. I jumped. It was Tom Trent.
"I wanted a bigger funeral than that," he said.
"So you didn't like it?" I asked.
"It was okay."
"Do you know who murdered you?" He stuck his big red face close to mine and shook his finger at me.
"I'm not going to tell you who it was."
Even as a ghost, he was thoroughly belligerent. "But why?" I asked. "Don't you want your murder avenged? Don't you want your murderer brought to justice?"
"Your mother is a nasty piece of work," he said. "I'd like her to be charged with my murder."
With a guttural laugh, he vanished. Chapter 16. I had never attended the Witchwood's brick-throwing contest before, so I was a little skeptical about my outfit. Ian had told me that everyone who attended the contest needed to wear a costume, and since it was the Witchwood's brick-throwing contest, and since I had a witch costume shoved in the bottom of my cupboard, my choice was obvious. However, I'd had the witch costume since I was 13, so it was a little short and a little tight. At the very least, Basil would enjoy it, I supposed.
"What on earth are you wearing?"
Basil asked as he arrived to pick me up. Silly me, but I failed to notice that Basil wasn't wearing a costume. I just assumed he was dressed as an accountant, and therefore dressed as himself. Jeans, blazer, and an expensive watch that his grandfather used to own. "Come on, Basil, we need to question Russell Reed. I have it on good authority that he entered the cheese rolling race. In fact, Russell was crowned the cheese rolling race champion last year. He'll be keen to defend his title." Basil eyed me with confusion.
"Why on earth would anyone be keen to defend that title?"
"You speak like a man who has never rolled a wheel of cheese down a hill."
"Yes," Basil replied. "Funny that."
I made Basil pull over at the liquor store where I bought 2 tiny bottles of vodka, the kind of tiny bottle you see despondent detectives down in Hollywood movies. Now, I wasn't technically a detective, but I did a lot of detecting, and often I felt despondent. Long story short, I downed those 2 tiny bottles of vodka in the car park without feeling a single ounce of shame.
"I thought one was for me,"
Basil said. "You're driving," I replied, "and you are not wearing a skirt that practically shows off your bottom." The Witchwood's brick-throwing contest was far more of a festival than a brick-throwing contest. Bricks were thrown, naturally, as were rubber chickens, but there were stalls to peruse and jams to buy. I was stunned on arrival that no one, literally no one else had dressed in a costume, and I wondered why Ian had told me that everyone in attendance needed to wear one. I was furious. "What on earth am I wearing?" I asked Basil, who laughed. He kissed me on the cheek.
"You look great."
"Liar."
"You look better than great."
"Hey," I grabbed Basil's hand. "There's Russell Reed. I'll catch up with you later."
"Don't turn anyone into a frog,"
Basil called after me. I made my way through the festival, trying and failing to ignore everyone who stared at me. Thankfully, Russell didn't spot me, so I had time to duck behind a giant novelty cheese wheel when I noticed Celia Watson approaching Russell. What did she want with him? Did they have ill feeling towards each other? It turns out the answer is no. They liked each other very much. This I could tell because they kissed right then and there as I crouched behind the cheese. So Russell Reed and Celia Watson were an item, or at least enough of an item to steal kisses at the Witchwood's brick-throwing contest. I made a mental note of their relationship, then straightened up and approached Russell after Celia left. Russell, I said, smoothing down my witch's skirt.
Yes?
My name's Laurel Bay. Can I have a word?
If this is about the cheese rolling, I'm afraid I don't offer my tips and tricks to all and sundry. I do, however, offer courses each summer. They are $700 for 3 lessons. You should take at least one course before entering the cheese rolling competition. It really is about safety first, you know. A lot of these young cheese rollers come in here all youthful and enthusiastic and end up dying.
Dying?
Well, not literally dying, but embarrassing themselves as they skid down the hill, their cheese roll flying off into the crowds of spectators.
I've actually entered the contest already, I said, and immediately regretted it. Why on earth would I lie about such a thing? I didn't know how to roll cheese. I knew how to eat cheese and then roll myself into bed, sure, but I suspected this was a whole different ballgame. Russell's body language changed instantly. I thought I saw a flash of respect in his eyes, but his tone grew sterner.
It's not safe, you know. In fact, the police have had to crack down on rebel cheese rolling competitions. Today is the only official cheese rolling competition. Did you know that?
Of course, I said. I didn't like his stern tone at all. I am a champion cheese roller myself. You know, from Finland.
You are from Finland?
Oui, I said, because I didn't know the Finnish word for yes.
But you sound Australian,
he protested. Finland and Australia have extremely similar accents. Everyone knows that. Russell frowned.
Where is your cheese?
I ate it in the car on the way here, so I'll have to buy a new wheel before competing.
You ate foam?
I was perplexed. Why would I eat foam?
The cheese wheels are fake, made from foam. Real cheese was deemed too dangerous.
Russell eyed me suspiciously.
What cheese rolling competition did you win in Finland?
The Jaja Ding Dong Cheese Rolling Championships, I stammered. It's one of the most prestigious competitions in Finland.
I've never heard of it, Russell replied. Very strange for a champion not to have their own foam cheese wheel, but I suppose you can pick up a replacement from the official tent. It's over there. Best of luck, Laurel.
You too, I said, and then I had to trudge over to the official tent because Russell didn't take his eyes off me for a second.
Now our cheese racing competition is a little different, the official informed me. Instead of everyone chasing one wheel of cheese, participants have their own individual wheel of cheese. If you catch your own cheese, you win 50 points, but if you catch an opponent's wheel of cheese, you earn 25 points. No points are awarded for failing to catch a wheel of cheese.
I see.
Here, write your name on the bottom of your cheese. That way we will know which one belongs to you. You can use this crayon.
I wrote my name on the cheese and headed to the starting line. Russell was already there, warming up. He seemed to have a pre-race ritual, which involved chanting and humming and throwing his arms up to the sky. I watched him for a time before I too started to chant, just in the hopes it helped. "Hey, Russell," I began. He cut me off.
"After the race."
Basil waved to me at the bottom of the hill, and I waved back. A man fired the starting gun, and I took off at a sprint down the hill. I figured if I started fast, the hill would do the rest of the work, which is true, but I also didn't count on the cheese starting fast. Several volunteers had released the cheese just as the gun fired, and it was impossible to tell which cheese belonged to which racer. I preferred the traditional way, where we all chased one wheel of cheese, but oh well. My ankles pounded as I scrambled down the hill. Several people fell, but I managed to keep my feet. I even managed to grab a wheel of cheese, though I had no idea if it was my wheel of cheese. The next thing I knew, I was sitting in the mud, ankles shot and knees scraped, clutching a wheel of foam cheese for dear life.
"That was brilliant,"
Basil cried. He helped me stand.
"Is this your cheese?"
I flipped the cheese over. No, it belonged to Russell Reed. His name was right there. Oh, no.
It was you, Russell screamed. You are the reason I could not defend my championship.
I'm sorry, I replied. I just grabbed any cheese wheel I could.
Now Jeremy Duggins is the new champion. He caught his own cheese and got 50 points. I only got 25 points.
That's not so bad. I only got 25 points too, I said sheepishly.
That might be good enough in Finland, but here, not so bad is hardly going to win any cheese races. You're just like Tom Trent.
I am nothing like Tom, I replied, hoping to goad a reaction out of Russell. Actually, hoping to gouda a reaction might be more fitting. He was a nice man.
Russell's ears turned pink. Tom was a terrible person. He tried to make me pay him $15,000, but that's not the worst part. He grew corn which made Celia's sun-loving plants stop growing.
What's wrong with that? Tom liked his corn.
No, he didn't, Russell shrieked. He hated corn. He thought corn was the worst food in the whole entire world. He didn't even eat corn chips. That's what kind of monster he was, a man who didn't even eat corn chips. The community garden was supposed to be productive. It was supposed to help people. Corn isn't productive.
Unless it is a chip?
Exactly. Corn is useless. Corn doesn't produce much, and it stops the other plants from getting enough sunlight. He was a bad man, that Tom. I'm not saying I'm glad he's dead, but now that he's dead, I never have to think about corn again.
I see, I replied. Russell snatched the cheese wheel out of my hands.
And today isn't a dress-up day, don't you know?
He glared at me and stormed off. I should have left that man's cheese wheel alone, I lamented, but I didn't know it was his. Besides, we got some good information, Basil. Celia and Russell are together. I spotted them kissing just before the race. I guess Russell is as protective of his girlfriend's plants as he is of his cheese wheels.
Basil nudged me in the ribs. Someone is waving at you.
I turned around. It was Jeremy Duggins, and he was blowing me kisses. Basil pushed up the sleeves of his shirt and made to walk over to Jeremy, but I managed to stop him. He's just excited because I helped him win the cheese race, I said, my cheeks burning.
No man should be that excited over cheese, he replied.
Maybe it's the witch's costume.
I was doing my best not to laugh. Basil looked at my legs. Let's get you home and into more appropriate attire.
I was thinking of going home with Jeremy, actually, I teased him. Without a word, Basil threw me over his shoulder and marched to the car, while we both laughed and laughed, and I flashed the Witchwoods brick-throwing contest my knickers, which were bright orange and covered with black cats. Chapter 17. I had no idea what I was going to say to Cameron Kerr, but I figured I would wing it. I had run through several scenarios and overthought it to the point that my head was spinning. I figured I would just turn up at his place and make up something on the spur of the moment. I thought I should check on Dylan before I went. He and Ian were sitting in Mum's living room, playing hymns on a pipe organ. I had never seen the pipe organ before. I figured Dylan had bought it, but I didn't want to ask. In fact, I didn't want to spend any time with Dylan or Ian, so I beat a hasty retreat. I didn't have any trouble finding Cameron's house, but I drove past it so I could look at the long fence on one side. It did indeed look like an expensive fence. Tom's driveway was covered with white, ornamental gravel. I figured that would have cost a pretty penny too, but I expect he hadn't tried to make his neighbours pay for it. As I did a U-turn and came back, I saw what looked like the detective's car driving down Cameron's driveway before driving away. I slowed down and then came to a stop on the street. I walked up the front path, which was rather steep and winding, and then knocked on the door. Cameron opened the door with a wide frown, which changed to a smile when his eyes focused on me.
Sorry, I thought you were the police again. Can I help you?
I'm Laurel Bay from the funeral home, I told him. He looked shocked.
Oh, I don't want to enroll in one of those pay now, go later schemes.
I held up both hands, palms outwards. No, I'm not here to sell you anything. I saw the detectives driving away. I wanted to have a chat with you about Tom Trent's death. Maybe we could help each other. He quirked one eyebrow.
How so?
The police suspect you and Russell Reed, and they also suspect Eliza, Celia, and my mother, I said. I thought we could discuss it and come up with an idea as to who did it.
All right, please come in.
Cameron ushered me into a living room, which smelt quite musty. I noticed the curtains were pulled over the windows, and I wondered when the house had last seen sunlight. He indicated I should sit on a large leather couch.
I don't know if I can be much help. Would you like a cup of herbal tea?
Yes, please. That would be good, thank you. As he left the room, I took the opportunity to study it. It was furnished rather unusually. A large cowhide lay across the floor under a rough-hewn coffee table. Rabbit traps hung from the wall, and more disconcertingly, heads of stuffed deers lined one wall, and in a large glass cabinet appeared to be a whole taxidermied sheep. The vibe, helped along by the high wooden beams, screamed hunting lodge. Cameron returned holding 2 steaming mugs. He put one in front of me.
My father was a hunter, he told me. He was a hunter in New Zealand. He shot that sheep there.
He gestured to the taxidermied sheep. Oh, was all I could manage. Cameron beamed at me and pushed on.
Well, I could never harm an animal, of course, but my father left all these things to me. I had them brought over from New Zealand when I moved to Australia years ago. Since he was going to shoot the sheep, it was better to have it taxidermied rather than leave its remains in a paddock, don't you think?
I suppose so, I said. I fought the urge to run out of the building. At least there were no rifles hanging on the walls.
I've hung some antique rabbit traps as decorations, he continued.
I nodded. I can see that. I felt as though I had walked into the lair of a serial killer.
Anyway, I hope you enjoy your tea. It's a mixture of lavender, licorice, lemongrass, and ginger.
Thank you. I sipped the tea. It tasted like unflavoured boiling water to me, and I wondered if he had forgotten to use the tea bag. It's nice, I lied. He beamed at me.
The police keep questioning me. They think I murdered Tom Trent over the $15,000 he was trying to get from me, but I told them it wasn't legal. Legally, Tom should have told us before he built the fence, and even if he had done so, I only had to pay half of the cheapest fence on my side. He didn't have a legal leg to stand on. I keep telling the police that, but they keep questioning me.
They keep questioning me too, I told him. My mother is out of town, but the police think I'm lying about it. They seem to think she murdered Tom Trent and has gone into hiding. He shot me a calculating look.
Yes, they did ask me if I knew where your mother was, but I don't know your mother. I doubt I've ever spoken to her.
I sipped some more boiling water before speaking. I have no idea where my mother is, and the detectives keep giving me the 3rd degree. It's obvious they think I'm lying, I said. Would you have any idea who could possibly have murdered Tom Trent? He sat down in the oversized leather wing-backed chair opposite me and sipped his herbal tea.
Oh, that's strong, he said, setting it aside.
I suspected he had put 2 tea bags in the one cup. I simply nodded. He pushed on.
I expected the police would find out who did it at first, but now that they keep questioning me, I've begun to consider the matter. I know I didn't do it, and I know Russell didn't do it. Russell is the other neighbour.
He gestured in the direction of where I imagined Russell's house would be. Tom was trying to get $15,000 out of him as well. I think apart from you, Russell, and my mother, the only other suspects they have are Eliza Entwistle and Celia Watson, I said. Eliza and Celia were on the Birds of Prey Community Church Garden Committee, along with my mother and Tom Trent. Eliza and Celia were upset because he grew his corn and overshadowed the sun-loving plants, and apparently he was very difficult to deal with. Nobody liked him being on the committee. That's hardly a motive for murder, so there must be something else that we don't know. Still, I can't think of any other possible suspects. Cameron picked up his tea, sipped it, pulled a face, and then put down his cup once more. Tom didn't have any friends because he wasn't well liked. I would have thought his son, Angus, did it, but his son obviously had a good alibi. Why did you say obviously? I asked him. He shrugged. Because if it wasn't a good alibi, the police would have done something about it by now. I nodded. Oh, of course. I also heard he had an ironclad alibi. You see, Tom and Angus didn't get on at all. Tom was really nasty to that kid, and so Angus left home as soon as he could. Why, he even left the country. Can you think of anyone else who might have murdered Tom? He rubbed his forehead hard. It could have been one of the many women Tom fooled around with. But he fooled around with them years ago, and they would have murdered him by now. What do you mean? I had already heard this, but wanted to prompt him to expand. He looked surprised. Didn't you know? Tom dated most of the women in this town. He dated Eliza for years. Went to Europe with her, he did. Then he dumped her and dated Celia for a long time. While he was dating those women, he was also having affairs with married women. A lot of the husbands in town were out for his blood. Do you think one of the husbands finally took revenge? I asked him. Cameron shook his head. I doubt it. Why would they wait for so many years? Murder is a dish best served cold, I said. He seemed to be thinking over my words. After an interval, he said, Maybe, but they would have been waiting quite a long time. He hasn't been a man about town for many years now. I didn't know he dated both Eliza and Celia, I said. That's interesting. If you're thinking Eliza or Celia murdered him, well, they would have done it years ago and not waited until now, he said. How rude of me. I haven't offered you anything to eat. Thanks, but I ate a lot before I came here, I said. Actually, I hadn't, but I wouldn't be surprised if he tried to serve me rabbit or snake or something equally abhorrent. So did Tom have any other children apart from Angus? Cameron laughed. He probably has illegitimate children all over town, but Angus actually isn't his child. I leant forward in my chair, almost spilling the contents of my mug on the cowhide on the floor. Tom was in Europe for a while, and then he came back with a child, he said. He seemed pleased to have a son, but he ruled that child with an iron rod and drove him away. He sent Angus to a primary school out of town. It was weird that he didn't let him go to the local primary school. He did let him go to the local high school, though. How strange. I wonder why. He chuckled. Tom was strange. I'm afraid I haven't been any help to you, have I? Yes, you have, I said. I had no idea that Tom dated Eliza and Celia many years ago. There could be a clue in there somewhere. If there is, I can't imagine what it could be. I stood up. Well, thanks for your time. Not at all, he said. I wasn't doing anything. I was just watching Murder, She Wrote. I love Jessica Fletcher, I told him. Wouldn't it be good if we could have a Jessica Fletcher moment? He screwed up his nose. What do you mean? You know, near the end of the episode, somebody says something obscure, something that isn't related to anything else in the episode, and that prompts Jessica to realize who the murderer is. His face lit up. Yes, I see what you mean. I thanked him again and headed for the door. I walked down the winding path and got in my car. I turned on the engine. Just as I did, the Bluetooth in my car showed an incoming call. I pressed the button to answer it as I pulled out onto the street.
Laurel, where have you been?
Dylan demanded in Mum's voice. Is something wrong? I asked.
Honestly, Laurel, anybody would think you were adopted.
And that's when I had the Jessica Fletcher moment. Chapter 18. Adoption. Europe. Tom wouldn't let his child go to the local primary school. I was fairly certain I was right, but I needed to speak with Basil. He didn't pick up, so I left a message on his voicemail to come to the funeral home as soon as possible. I had a brewing headache, so I stopped at the supermarket on the way home to buy some Advil. As I rounded the corner and came upon the health food section, I saw Eliza and Angus talking. When they saw me, Angus hurried away without acknowledging me at all, and Eliza walked over to me.
Hi, Laurel. I haven't seen Angus for years. He seems such a nice young man, nothing like his father.
I came straight to the point. When did you get back to Witch Woods? I asked. You went away to Europe, didn't you?
Yes, I've been to Europe many times, she said. Why do you ask?
No reason, just curious, I said, trying to sound nonchalant. I smiled at her and shoved some healthy food into my basket. Maybe I could feed it to Basil's 2 pet sheep later. I hoped I hadn't made her suspicious, but I had to know. I drove straight to the church. I hoped I would catch Pastor Green in the church office. It seemed I was in luck. He looked up, startled to see me.
Sorry, Laurel, I was a million miles away. Has your mother been in touch?
No, not at all, I said. Pastor Green, do you have a key to the greenhouse full of the poisonous plants?
Yes, it's hanging up over there.
He pointed to a wooden rack with keys on it. The keys were not labelled. So there's that key there, and then Eliza, Tom, Mum, and Celia all had their own keys to the greenhouse.
Yes, that's right, he said. What's this about, Laurel?
I'm fairly certain one of the community garden members is the murderer. I'm trying to piece it all together. Do you know anything about Angus Trent being adopted?
Pastor Green frowned. Yes, I believe that's fairly common knowledge.
And do you know who his mother is?
No, probably even Tom himself didn't know that.
My spirits sank. I was hoping the pastor would know. I know Tom had a bit of a reputation with the ladies, so I thought perhaps Angus was his child and that he'd threatened the mother and taken the child for himself.
But why would he threaten the mother?
Pastor Green asked me. I shrugged. Maybe she had left him. I thought Pastor Green would disagree with me, but to my surprise he nodded.
You know, that's the sort of thing Tom Trent would have done. Have you told the police, Laurel?
I shook my head. I don't have any proof. I'm going to go home and make some notes, and then I'll go and see them. I think I know who did it, and a DNA test will help.
Please don't take any chances, Laurel, the pastor admonished me. There's still a murderer on the loose.
I walked out of the building and almost ran into Eliza. Had she heard what I'd said? Her expression was impassive. I nodded to her and hurried to my car. I had to get this thing figured out quickly. I drove to the funeral home and let myself in, but instead of going straight to my apartment, I thought I should check on Mum first.
Thank goodness it's you, Laurel, Ernie said as soon as I walked into the foyer. That annoying ghost won't leave me alone. Can you talk to him?
He won't listen to me either, Ernie, but I think I've solved his murder. That will make him cross over.
Thank goodness. The sooner the better.
Ernie floated a little and then landed with a thud. With that, he vanished. I continued on down to the preparation room to check on Mum. I didn't really like to look at her, but I wanted to make sure the mortuary cabinet was working fine. I opened the mortuary cabinet door just a little to give Mum some air, all the while averting my eyes. Dylan seemed quite happy now, and if Mum's spirit went back into her body while she was trapped inside the mortuary cabinet, she would panic. I sat down at the desk to write some notes. I was fairly certain Eliza was the murderer. What if Angus was her child? Eliza was a retired primary school teacher, and that would explain why Tom had not allowed Angus to attend the local primary school. I thought through the scenario. What if Eliza had become pregnant with Tom's child while in Europe, and Tom had wanted the child for himself? Maybe they had even broken up. Maybe Tom came back to Australia with Angus, along with legal adoption papers, and had threatened Eliza in some way to stay away from Angus. It was pure speculation, but the pieces did fit. Eliza took trips to Europe on a regular basis. If I was right, then Eliza and Angus could have been in it together. Eliza had the means and the opportunity, as well as the motive. Tom stood to inherit everything, and he had the perfect alibi. Yes, that was it. I called Basil again, but it went to voicemail once more. I sighed aloud. "Basil, where are you?" I said to the phone. I was certain it was Eliza. If the police ran a DNA test, they would find out she was Angus's mother. Still, that wouldn't prove she was the murderer, but it would certainly throw new light on the case, and the police could investigate that avenue. I stood up and pushed Mum's cabinet back in. I didn't want to leave her unfrozen for too long. I opened the door to the preparation room, but before I could take a step, Eliza barged in. She was holding a rifle. "Where did you get that?" I said, alarmed.
"I live out of town on a farm, Laurel. I've had it for years, and the police don't know I have it. I use it for shooting snakes. All kinds of snakes," she said in malevolent tones. "I see you figured it was me."
"So it was you," I said. "Ernie, go and get Basil."
"Who is Ernie?"
"The resident ghost." Eliza snorted rudely.
"I followed you from the supermarket. Not a smart move, Laurel. I overheard what you said to Pastor Green."
"The police can't prove it was you, though," I said, desperately hoping Ernie had heard me.
"Yes, but they can easily prove I'm Angus's mother, and then they'll soon figure out we were in it together."
"So what exactly happened?" I said.
"When I was in Europe with Tom, I found out he was having affairs. I was pregnant at the time, but I left him just after the baby was born. He took Angus from me and said he would kill me if I ever tried to claim him as my own."
"But surely you could have gone to the police," I said. "You could have proven you were his mother."
"No, Tom made me promise not to," she said.
That didn't sound right to me, and I said so.
"All right, if you must know. Tom paid me a lot of money and I signed a contract," she said. "So, you see, I didn't have a legal leg to stand on. If I ever tried to get my son back, Tom had evidence that he had paid me for him."
I was incredulous. "You sold your own son to Tom Trent?"
She shrugged. "I needed the money. Anyway, I stayed away for a few years, like in the contract, and then I came back to town, but Tom did his best to keep Angus away from me."
A manic look covered her face. "When did you tell Angus you were his mother?" I asked her.
"It was only a couple of years ago," she said. "He occasionally came back to Australia to see his father, and one day I told him the whole story. Or maybe not the whole story. I left out the part about Tom paying me for him, but I told him his father had threatened me. There was no love lost between the two of them, you understand, and I hinted that if anything were to happen to his father, that he would inherit everything. Tom was a very wealthy man."
"So how did you cook up the scheme to kill him?" I asked her.
"It was the fence," she said. "When I found out Tom was trying to extort money from his two neighbors, I thought that would be a good time to murder him because there would be more suspects than only the community garden people. And I figured the police would think it too obvious that a gardener would actually murder someone with poisonous plants. I hoped the method of murder would throw suspicion onto the neighbors. Besides, nobody liked Tom.
She advanced upon me with the rifle. I backed away. "So, what do you intend to do with me?" I was immediately sorry I had asked.
"I'm going to shoot you and then put you in one of these freezer cabinets," she said. "Nobody will look in there for you. Nobody will know where you are. They won't find you for ages." She cackled. "Are any in use at the moment?"
"See for yourself," I said. Eliza walked to the row. The one closest was the one containing Mum. She pulled it out and then screamed at the top of her lungs.
"Thelma! Thelma is in here! Did you murder your own mother? The police think she's missing. She's stone cold dead."
Just then, Mum opened her eyes and sat up, her arms outstretched.
"Swearing is not of God, Eliza,"
she said in a deathly frightening monotone.
"But now ye also put off all these, anger, wrath, malice, blasphemy, filthy communication out of your mouth." Colossians chapter 3, verse 8.
Eliza dropped her rifle and fainted. I ran over to the cabinet and helped Mum out. Janet's coat was on the chair, so I grabbed it and put it over Mum's shoulders.
"What's going on, Laurel?" she said. "I don't remember why I'm here."
"You were trying to help me because Eliza wanted to kill me," I told her. "Eliza killed Tom Trent." Mum frowned, clearly confused.
"Tom Trent is dead? Are you sure?"
"You were struck by lightning, Mum, and it affected your memory." Just then Basil burst through the door. "Laurel, are you all right?" "Your timing is a little off," I told him. "Ernie came to get me. He said Eliza was the murderer, and she was here to murder you. I called the police." I could hear sirens in the distance.
"Who's Ernie?"
Mum said. Basil stared at Mum. "Mrs. Bay, you're back." Mum rubbed her eyes with both hands.
"But I haven't been away."
Eliza's eyelids flickered, and she made to sit up. I kicked her rifle away. "You had better go and let the police in," Basil said to me. "I'll keep an eye on Eliza." I didn't need telling twice. Adrenaline was pumping through me, so I made it to the front door in double-quick time. "What's happening?" Detective Prescott asked me. "Eliza Entwistle is the murderer," I blurted out. "She knew I was onto her because she heard me asking Pastor Green about her. She is Angus Trent's biological mother." Both detectives gasped. I was in the preparation room just then, and she came with a rifle to kill me, only my mother just arrived back and startled her. I was able to take the rifle from her, and Basil's there now. Both detectives appeared perplexed, but followed me to the preparation room. Eliza was swearing profusely, and my mother was sitting on a chair with her fingers firmly over both ears. "When did you get back, Mrs. Bay?" Detective Prescott asked her. "Mum's had a terrible shock, and she isn't coherent," I told him. Thankfully, Mum didn't speak. I pushed on. "Eliza confessed everything to me."
"He deserved it," Eliza said. "Tom was a horrible person."
She continued to swear as the detectives led her away. "Mum, I had better get you home and make you a nice cup of tea," I said. Basil shook his head. "We had better make her a cup of tea here, because she's probably still a bit weak and unsteady." "Good idea." I went upstairs to fetch a blanket from the apartment.
"I don't know why I'm so cold," she said when I wrapped it around her. "Where's Ian?"
"He's probably at the house with the new boarder. Speaking of Ian, I should probably call him." I did so at once. "Can you come to the funeral home? Mum's back and she wants to speak to you." Ian didn't take long to arrive. He was followed by Dylan, who was back in his old clothes.
"There's the nice boarder,"
Mum said. Dylan looked confused.
"Have we met?"
"Dylan was struck by lightning," I told her.
"Yes, and he licked the moss off trees and started wearing women's clothes,"
Ian said. For once, Mum was speechless. Chapter 19. Sometimes I pinched myself. How did I manage to get through life without knowing how to cook? Well, after my recent camping disaster, I decided I needed to learn how to be self-sufficient. I mean, who knows when I might end up stranded in bushland again, smearing Parisian skincare cream on my burning bottom. However, I knew I would never learn to cook unless I had more incentive than the nagging fear of setting fire to tents with flying marshmallows, which is why I invited Basil over for dinner. "I'm cooking," I told him proudly on the phone. "Wonderful," he replied. Can you cook?" "Obviously," I replied. "I am practically a macaroni-starred chef."
"Do you mean a Michelin-starred chef?"
"I have to run," I said, hanging up the phone. Honestly, Basil could be so dim sometimes, bless him. Why would anyone use Michelin stars as a rating system to score restaurants on their quality? Macaroni makes much more sense. After all, everybody loves macaroni and cheese. The first thing I did was to remove the batteries from the smoke alarm. I knew this was what all the great chefs did before they cooked, because no one wants to hear all that beeping when they are filleting a loaf of sourdough or grilling a hamster or whatever it is fancy chefs did in the kitchen. Then I opened a bottle of wine, put on a cucumber face mask, and fell asleep in front of the television. I awoke an hour later, much to my dismay. Now I had little time to cook dinner. In fact, I didn't even have anything to cook. I didn't even know what I wanted to cook, so I rummaged through the cupboards for a cookbook or magazine. It didn't take me more than a minute to find a book on food to cook for a baby shower. I had no idea why that was in my apartment, but at this point I was not about to complain. I took a swig of wine and paged through the recipes. Soon I had found a recipe for a meatloaf baby. "A meatloaf baby?" I exclaimed. Now that sounds horrifying. I mean meatloaf shaped like a baby. And it is horrifying. But I was desperate and drunk, and I had a cucumber mask melting off my face. So I was not in the ideal state to use reason. I grabbed a coat, the bottle of wine, and charged out of the front door. I needed things, meatloaf things, and bacon, because that's what you used to clothe the meatloaf baby. I was so in the moment, I didn't even stop to help up the man who had staggered backwards at seeing my cucumber-smeared face and toppled into a pyramid of cans. "Meatloaf baby," I called over my shoulder, as though this somehow explained my appearance and lack of concern for either the gentleman or the fallen pyramid. Soon I was back home with the ground beef, egg, onion, milk, breadcrumbs, brown sugar, and mustard. I preheated the oven, combined all the ingredients, and shaped a baby on a lightly greased baking dish before adding his bacon clothes. The whole thing looked horrific, like something from a scary movie, but I was in far too deep to back out now. I spent the next hour getting ready. I didn't know much about fashion or beauty, but still I decided to straighten my hair. Only I didn't actually own a hair straightener, so I lay my head down on the ironing board and went over my hair with the iron. It turned out better than I expected, except for the chunk of hair I accidentally burnt off. "What smells in here?" Basil asked after I greeted him at the door. He was carrying a bottle of wine, wearing that blazer I loved, and looking delicious in much the same way my meatloaf baby looked horrific. Basil visibly recoiled as I took the meatloaf from the oven. "I'm sorry," I shrieked. "It looks like a bad meatloaf baby." "What does a good meatloaf baby look like?" Basil asked. He recoiled from the baby as though the meatloaf baby was a mouse and he was a teenager with a fear of rodents. "We need to call Pastor Green right now, Laurel." "Does Pastor Green like meatloaf?" "No," Basil replied. "We need him here to pray." "Oh, it's not that bad," I said dismissively. Maybe I did lie about being as good as a macaroni-starred chef." Basil didn't reply. Instead, he tossed the meatloaf, tray and all, into the garbage. "I'll fix this," he said. "It's too late," I replied. "It's never too late," Basil said. "You stay here, clean up, put the batteries back in the smoke alarm. I'll go to the shops and buy something we can cook together. Something not terrifying." Sighing, I nodded and wiped my brow with the back of my hand. "Can you buy another bottle of wine?" "Of course," Basil said. I waited for him to leave before slumping in a chair, and there I remained until he returned home. Sure, I had made a complete mess of the night, but I'd also caused Basil to go for a walk, and walks are good, right? Walks are good for the heart or whatever. In fact, I might have just saved his life by making him just that little bit healthier tonight. I was literally a hero, and I'd continue my heroic actions by drinking the wine, every last drop. Really, there was no point in Basil undoing all his hard, healthy work by guzzling down a glass of vino on his return. No, that wouldn't do in the least. I might have to eat all of the chocolate in the apartment too, just to make sure he wouldn't feel any temptation. I was the perfect girlfriend. "You've probably spoiled your dinner now," Basil said when he returned to find me lying on the kitchen floor, surrounded by 100 chocolate wrappers. "I'm starving," I lied. There was no point telling Basil I ate all of the chocolate to save his life. Men are not as logical as women. He would simply not understand. "Save some for me," Basil added when I opened the wine and drank straight from the bottle. "The chef is not allowed to drink," I retorted, and then I hiccuped. I was already having nightmares about the meatloaf baby, and I had not even gone to sleep yet. "Says who?" "Chefs use knives. You can't drink and use knives. It's dangerous. You could hurt yourself." Basil took the wine bottle out of my hand. "I am perfectly capable of cooking and drinking, thank you very much. I am making a cauliflower, pancetta and taleggio pasta bake." "Without the cauliflower?" "With the cauliflower." "Gross." "It wouldn't be a cauliflower, pancetta and taleggio pasta bake if I left out the cauliflower." "No," I replied. "It would be better. How can I help?" "You can help by getting out of my kitchen." "It's my kitchen," I protested. "Not tonight. Go and watch some television." "Fine," I huffed, even though I was pleased. I settled on the couch and flipped through the channels. Every now and then I would hear Basil make a noise of frustration, but I knew his frustration would grow if I went in to see if he needed anything. Basil could be stubborn, and it made him feel like a little kid if I babied him. No, he would cook us a lovely cauliflower, pancetta and taleggio pasta bake. Hopefully without the cauliflower, the meatloaf baby would be forgotten and all would be well in the world. An hour later, I sat at the table with Basil, who did his best to pretend he couldn't see me picking the cauliflower out of the bake. "This is brilliant," I told him, trying not to catch his eye. He leant across the table and took my hand. "It worries me," he began, "you investigating murders. I don't want anything to happen to you." I felt my ears redden. "Nothing will happen to me," I replied. "I have you to protect me." Basil kissed me on the forehead, and then he kissed me on the tip of my nose, and then he kissed me on my lips. "I would never let anything happen to you," he said, "even though you make terrifying meatloaf babies. Where did you even find a recipe for that?" I almost told him, but then I snapped my mouth shut. What if Basil thought I was hoarding baby books? What if he thought I wanted to have a whole car full of Basil babies and that scared him off? I cleared my throat and scrunched up my nose. "It's an old family recipe, the meatloaf baby. In fact, my mother even served a meatloaf baby at her wedding." I added that last part for extra spice. "Then it's settled," Basil replied. "When we get married, our wedding cake will be a meatloaf baby." You don't have to do that." "No," Basil replied. "I must insist. It's important we continue family traditions. You're sweet to protest, but I am afraid I have made up my mind."
"A meatloaf baby wedding cake,"
"A meatloaf baby wedding cake," Basil said firmly, and he smiled. I smiled too. While it wasn't a proposal, Basil had mentioned marriage. What a week it had been. Things had seemed so dire. My mother and Dylan had both been killed by lightning. There was a case of repossession. I had set a whole church camp on fire, and stinging nettle had inflicted the most terrible pain on my bottom. A murderer had been intent on killing me. Yet now all was good. My mother and Dylan were alive, my bottom was soothed, and the murderer was in custody. Everything had been so distressing and alarming, but then had turned around completely in a short space of time. I realized the old saying, "It's always darkest before dawn," was indeed correct. When things look their darkest, it means dawn is truly about to appear, and dawn always comes. The end. You can find other audiobooks by Morgana Best exclusively at morganabest.com. You've just listened to Repossessed, Book 6 in the Witchwood's Funeral Home series, written by Morgana Best, narrated by Amy Soakes. Text copyright 2020 by Morgana Best. Audio production copyright 2023 by Morgana Best. If you've enjoyed this audiobook, please consider leaving a review and recommending on social media or directly to friends and family. And you can find other audiobooks by Morgana Best exclusively at morganabest.com. Thanks for listening.